We just text Andrew. Okay, we're ready to start. Okay. Okay, well, this is a hearing of the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee. We are taking up the transportation issues in the subdivision staging policy. We're going to get started. The first item is about non-auto driver mode share. Glenn, did you want to provide some background? I think I'd like Casey or planning staff to provide some background on this whole section as we get started, just to kind of put a framework over it all. But we'll start with you, Glenn.
Okay. This is actually a follow-up from the Transportation Demand Management Bill the Council approved about 1.5 years ago, maybe a little more than a year ago. One of the things that the Council wanted the Planning Board to do is, in this SSP, was to recommend non-auto driver mode share goals for those areas where they don't exist in master plans. And that's important because for there to be a transportation demand management system, we need to know what the goals are in each area. The TDM's plan does not apply to the green area, so we're really only talking about red, orange, and yellow, or purple if you end up coming back with purple. Right now it's just red. So you'll see on circle 11 of the packet today, and Lisa, if you can put that up. Lisa Cavoni's volunteered to help out. Thank you, to be the poster of slides. It's only going to be these 2 slides, and that'll be it, I think. Pam is working on her packet, which is due today for the next SSP work session. This page, whoop, you had it. Next page. There you go. I think that's the one. Is that circle 11? The next one. There you go. Oh, keeps jumping around. Anyway, the first slide is supposed to be those areas where that one. That's where the goals exist. So those are master plans which have non-auto driver mode share goals. Again, this is where the planning area is supposed to get to eventually. There's no time limit on it. And so, for example, in Bethesda, the goal set in that master plan, just approved a few years ago, is to achieve ultimately 55% of both residents and employees together, blended, arriving to work or commuting into Bethesda in the peak hour by means other than driving. So whether it's biking, walking, taking transit, riding in a carpool or a van pool, telecommuting, anything but driving, 55%, and et cetera. If you go to the next page, go ahead, there you go. These are the areas that don't have standards yet, and this is what the planning staff worked on over the summer. I should say this was not included in the board's final draft CGP that came over August 1st. They just hadn't finished the work yet. And so the staff worked on this over August, and the planning board reviewed it on September 10th, and this is what they've come up with. And you'll see, again, percentages for either a blended rate like it is in Twin Brook, which is 45%. That would be of all employees and residents going to work or from work during the morning peak in Twin Brook. The goal is to get to the point where 45% are not driving. And you have some where the goals are just for employees, like in Glenmont, which mostly the Glenmont policy area is mostly employment. So 30% would arrive by means other than driving. Many of these, the bottom half or 2/3 of the chart, are just residential goals, because most of those areas are strictly or almost entirely residential. and you see the percentages there. And so I'm recommending the council approve these, the committee and the council approve these, and incorporate both sets, both the existing and the new NADMS figures in the SSP, so they become official.
So first of all, I want to say this is the result of legislation that I worked on for several years. Partnered up with former Councilmember Berliner, worked with the executive branch, DOT, community task force, crafted this very carefully over a considerable period of time. I think we finally kind of finalized it maybe a year ago. It's probably one of my favorite legislative initiatives that no one outside of this who's listening right now will ever understand, but it will, I think, really pay off over time. The idea here, as you said, is these percentages, these NADMS goals, will be the goal that a particular development will need to show that it has a plan to achieve, right? Basically, where they have to help move the policy area towards that goal. And so the intent is to start focusing the county's development process on including mitigation measures that are helping to reduce the use of single occupant vehicles and to really step up our partnership with employers and property owners to have a really intelligent transportation management system, and one where we're constantly actively managing all of these areas and working in partnership with the private sector to help reduce vehicle trips, which obviously reduces the load on our infrastructure and reduces the growth of traffic and pays off in many different ways. So Gary, I've seen you nodding your head a bunch. I'd welcome your comments.
Well, we appreciate this. This really is a good step, a good move forward. One that is necessary really to do the implementation of the next generation TDM, which you worked on so well with us. We have executive regulations that should be out relatively soon, final reviews, and so that's a good step. The only comment we have is that we really, on the page that's up there, you see on the yellow and orange residents, a lot of residential goals, which are fine, but there's no either combined goal or employees goal, and some of them it's quite appropriate. Obviously, Potomac, North Potomac, perhaps Clarksburg. But Germantown and Silver Spring Tacoma Park, the parts that, Bethesda, Chevy Chase. So I would say this is a good start, but I think we also want to work on the employee side.
Okay. So normally you would prefer to have a kind of differentiated goal that says employees and residential.
Or combined.
Or
a blended rate, yeah. A blended rate. But I think that's still something we can work on.
Okay.
If you like, if you like these for now, you could act on these now. But then again, we have a couple of weeks of work sessions. If DOT can work with planning staff and fine tune this even more, we can bring it back up and just make some tweaks to this.
Okay.
Yeah, I have some suggestions on this, and I'm very open to modifying this. I think the recommendation of the planning board is actually to keep working on it, not just to adopt these as they're written. I've got a slide I won't inflict on you right now, just showing the actual NADMS for every planning area in the county. And I think what's interesting is some of them sort of underperform or overperform relative to what you would expect from their proximity to transit or their land use context. In general, they fall into line in terms of their rank order in the way that you expect. But I think we should be looking at setting some targets that are both achievable but also push each area to do better, particularly the areas that are underperforming that are near high quality transit or in urbanized areas, to try to bump them up a little bit. So differentiation would be good.
Let me actually add to what Casey's saying. Some of the ones that I saw that may be a little bit out of line now aren't so much the new ones, but the existing ones. Because, again, these come out of master plans, some of which are quite old now. And so you have some goals like in Germantown Town Center, where the goal is only 25% of employees and NADMS. In some of the other areas of Clarksburg, I think is actually even higher, which to me doesn't make sense. Germantown should be higher than Clarksburg. So the problem with that, though, of course, is these are actually in master plans. So I'm not quite sure legally if we can change a master plan NADMS in the SSP. But I think that's something we ought to at least look at as well.
Okay. Can you explain how this meshes with all of the additional tests that are being proposed today? I know there's some allusion to that in the packet or mention of it, but let me just start by asking Casey, but I could get some comments from others. I'm a little unclear. It seemed to me that, a specific development will be provided with a set of, choices for how it's going to meet the NADMS goal. And that was kind of how we were going to proceed with, ensuring that walking and public transportation and biking are accounted for. So can I just start with you, Casey? Can you talk a little bit about how you see these in relationship to the other tests, or perhaps your staff? Because
some of it is master plan staging requirements, but there's also in some cases TMAGs that get tied to mode share goals, and so that becomes like the benchmark for negotiating an agreement.
But you're getting rid of TMAGs, right?
Right. Well, you're getting TDM plans.
Exactly. We replaced TMAGs with TDM.
Right.
But are they the same? Do they cover the same development? Does every development have to?
So there's a chart that we have that you passed with the legislation that talks about red, orange, and yellow, and where there are no requirements. So in the red area, let's just talk about that. I'm just looking at the chart. No requirements are under 25,000 gross square feet. Okay. Then basic program, which is pretty much what we're doing now, is 25 to 100,000 square feet. Anything over 100,000 square feet, you got to go directly to a results program. That's where the numbers that are here have to be met. And there's time frames and processes in the red areas. The orange areas, of course, have a little more leeway and the up to 50,000 square feet for no requirements, 100,000 square feet for the basic, and then 100 to 200,000. you have to try very hard to show progress to meeting an action plan, and then anything over 200,000. So if you're in an orange area and you have a 200,000 square foot development, then you have to have a results program that actually meets the numbers that are shown on the slides. The yellow area then, of course, has more leeway in terms of no requirements until 75,000 square feet, and then you have the 75 to 100,000, and there really is never a requirement on the results program in the yellow areas. So going from yellow to orange is a big difference for larger projects, and going from orange to red requires more developments to be included into more stringent and TDM requirements. So by moving some of the areas that you just did from this morning, from perhaps from orange to red, they would be subject to these new tighter TDM requirements.
Chris?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the objective of this program overall. And when we've been talking about adequacy, part of that is the types of trips that are made, and the intention of this program is to shift those trips to the less impactful modes like transit, walking, and biking. and the emphasis is increased based on the transit capacities and presence of walking and biking infrastructure that define the different color policy areas. So ultimately what this is trying to do is reduce the automobile trip generation so that it's coincident with the other standards you're adopting for adequacy.
Now,
Yeah.
is this duplicative with the proposed tests for pedestrians and bike and transit, Casey? Is this duplicative, or do these two integrate?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's a useful. First of all, I think that it's useful for assessing whether or not you're getting the most out of the transit investment. For example, I'm looking at this chart that I keep threatening to share with everybody right now that shows Glenmont's NADMS is just over half of the non-auto driver mode share of Friendship Heights, which is the best performing metro area. So that should tell you, NADMS for Friendship Heights is something approaching it's over 65%. In Glenmont, it's just over 35%. So that shows you that there's a pretty wide divergence or wide spectrum of performance in terms of how much these metro stations are succeeding in getting a high proportion of people to take the metro or to use some non-auto driver mode share for getting to work. I think that sort of guides us, and not only in master plans but in other contexts, like when we're negotiating with individual projects, to say, number one, what's realistic, so we can be pretty sure, like Glenmont is probably not going to be at 65-70% anytime soon, but also where are the places that we want to push to make more investments in transit, biking, walking infrastructure, and also think about how we can reorient the land use to drive it in the right direction.
Let me just add a couple things. To answer your question, Hans, about does this interact with the pedestrian bicycle test? The pedestrian bicycle test, which we'll get to a little bit later, requires a certain amount of infrastructure to be done. This test basically says what is the performance. It's a performance goal, so it's a little bit different. They're in sync to a large part. I think Casey brought up a really good example of what I was trying to explain earlier about the existing master plans. Many of them are probably really out of date. Friendship Heights is a really good example. But it doesn't affect any of your decisions immediately in terms of what you did this morning on congestion standards for the motor vehicle or for impact. Certainly doesn't have any effect on impact taxes. So those are the points.
Where I was really asking was about the new tests that are being proposed for transit, biking, and pedestrian, which sound great. I'm just trying to understand how they mesh with the NADMS development requirements. Do we need both?
One is infrastructure and one is performance. The performance one is what all the policies that you do to try to get people out of cars, or out of driving cars. So
they're complementary.
They're complementary. That's a good way of saying it.
Good. Just wanted to clear that up for myself. All right, let's proceed. So we've got proposed. So we're going to get more. So we can hold. I mean, I think we could say my colleagues agree that we sort of generally are approving the proposed mode shares, but we'll get a revised mode share list from planning. You'll continue working on this. Is that
Yes.
what we just said?
And if we could also, again, look at the legal aspects, could we change the mode share goals in master plans in the SSP? If we can't, we can't. But if we can, that would be useful as well. Okay. Is that 3-0, Mr. Friedson on, or I don't know if you took off.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any expressions.
Yeah, I'm fine with it, with the plan. And I see Mr. Friedson's at the bottom.
All right.
Well, you can take the slide off now, Lisa. That helps. Can you see Mr. Friedson now?
I saw him.
Okay, so it's okay.
Here's
Good.
the thumbs up.
Okay, 3. Okay, so 3-0. Okay.
The official formal thumbs up.
All right, the next large issue has several different aspects to it is local area transportation review, which is the transportation test now in the SSP. There are actually 4 components of that now, and the planning board's recommending adding a 5th. The 4 being the motor vehicle test, the bicycle test, the pedestrian test, and the transit test. And there is an attachment, which I'm not going to ask Lisa to put up, which shows those last 3 tests were actually added in 2016, but it shows the projects that were actually built or being built that were required by those 3 new tests. They're all end up being results of either the bicycle or pedestrian test. The transit test didn't result in any improvements because there weren't any that had to meet that requirement. So first, the motor vehicle test. Currently, again, this is a test. This is what local area review, in fact, was for decades until 2016 when it was expanded to look at other modes. And it looks at the performance at intersections. This, as I was saying this morning, the standard for delay, congestion delay, around metro stations is much looser than it is in orange areas, which is looser than yellow areas and looser than in green areas. And there's a chart, table 1 in the packet, which actually has the existing LATR or motor vehicle standards by policy area. And it's given actually in 3 different ways. It's given in terms of a critical lane volume, which I'll talk about in a little bit. It's given in terms of the ratio of volume to capacity, and it's also given in relation to the average vehicle delay at an intersection, which is really the one we use now. But they're all related. And so those table 1 are the standards that we use now. And the range of the standard in terms of delay is from 120 seconds per vehicle in the red areas to as little as 41 seconds per vehicle in rural areas, 48 seconds per vehicle in Damascus. The planning board is recommending several changes to actually all 4 tests. First of all, for the motor vehicle test, they have several changes. One is they would make the same recommendation they actually made 4 years ago, which is that in red policy areas, we should not have a motor vehicle test. So instead of having a standard of 120 seconds per vehicle, there would be no standard. Congestion could rise to whatever it rises to. Their concern is that with the test as it is now, it does require developers in metro station areas or red areas to do a traffic study. And in most cases, nearly all cases, the result of that test does not show a failure within the policy area for 120 seconds per vehicle, although it could. In fact, it has in the past shown some failures for what we call gateway intersections, which are the ones that are just outside of the metro station areas, but through the traffic has to process. For example, Bethesda, Jones Bridge Road, and Rockville Pike, which is outside the Bethesda CBD, but has a standard. And if you're a development in Bethesda and you have to look at intersections that are nearby, that's one of them. But they would get rid of the test within the red policy areas. The development attorneys at Lurch-Early Brewer support that, as does the Coalition of Smarter Growth. The Greater Colesville Citizens Association, Dan Wilhelm, concurs with that. Another argument the board makes is that they draw this conclusion that the motor vehicle test just leads to adding turn lanes and through lanes, which makes things more difficult for biking and walking, and so they don't want to see that. And we're going to be having a discussion later about the mitigation priorities. The county executive disagrees. His position is that we should maintain the current test, which is already pretty loose, 120 seconds per vehicle. However, the current system also says that we should be having, ultimately, we call unified mobility programs, or UMPs, created in really all the areas, period, but particularly in the metro station policy areas. That was a device that the council created a few years ago, first in White Oak. In fact, it's the only place so far. But the next one up on the docket is Bethesda, which basically say, okay, individual developers, okay, you don't have to do a traffic study anymore. We will do the traffic study for you. We'll do the entire, in the case of Bethesda, all the development that's going to yet happen in Bethesda, figure out what the traffic impact of that is all ultimately, figure out the cost of that, and then apportion that cost to any new development according to the number of trips that are generated by that development. And so it's a situation where they just essentially pay that trip rate times the number of square feet of their development, depending on the type of development. Or just, I'm sorry, the trips generated by that development times the rate, and that's what they pay, and that they pass the local review test. So the exec is saying, for example, in Bethesda, keep the 122nd per vehicle standard until the council approves a Bethesda UMP. You know, in the case of Bethesda, that could happen really in the next few months. Depends when DOT sends it over, or the executive sends it over. And in other areas, as soon as those UMPs are being developed. And so there aren't any, I don't think, under development yet in Silver Spring or Wheaton or Grosvenor or Twin Brook, places like that, or Friendship Heights for that matter. But my recommendation basically is concur with the executive. Keep the standard for now, but look forward to the point time where we can have UMPs in effect for all the metros, all the red areas. Of course, I consider this when we're talking about red areas being metro station areas, not the purple line areas. But nevertheless, this would apply now for all of those areas. In fact, the 122nd per vehicle standard, I'm sorry, the no test at all idea would now apply if you followed what the committee's recommended this morning. It wouldn't apply to any of the purple line areas either. So there'd be no tests in any of those areas as well. But again, just summarize, again, recommend that they go with the executive, keep the standard, but get these UMPs done as quickly as we can, hopefully all in the next 4 years. And then at that point, there really wouldn't be a test anymore. It would just be paying that fee.
The only thing I would add to that is that the UMPs are for all of the criteria that's tested in LATR.
Right.
The bicycle, the pedestrian, the transit. So it's not just traffic.
Right.
Okay,
correct.
Can we hear from planning about?
Yeah, I think it's important to separate the idea of what the SSP does, which is not just to set a payment, but to determine, in theory at least, whether or not development can occur. So it's not a question of, is 120 seconds too much or too little delay, or could we tolerate more than that? Nothing about the SSP prevents the government from making whatever decisions it wants to about transportation in any of these red policy areas. If you agree in principle that we should be using the UMPs, then I don't see why we should be applying LATR tests, which could potentially stop development in the absence of UMPs, because all the UMP does is set a fee. So if you agree that it's reasonable to set up this UMP that says, okay, we're going to allocate the cost of all the transportation improvements in downtown Bethesda across, X number of square feet of future development and just charge everybody a pro rata rate, then why not allow for development to proceed without the UMP on a basically pay-go basis until the UMP can be developed? Because the alternative is to apply these intersection congestion tests, which are never actually going to be enforced, in the sense nobody's going to widen the intersection. Nobody's going to build an interchange at these gateway intersections like Cedar Lane or Jonesbridge Road or East-West Highway and Connecticut Avenue. In fact, the current SSP, in fact, the last several SSPs have explicitly recognized that it is a bad idea to make these kind of quote-unquote improvements in urban areas. Silver Spring in the SSP for many years has had a provision that says no matter what the traffic tests say, you never widen the intersections in downtown Silver Spring, particularly Colesville and Georgia. And guess what? Not only has development been allowed to proceed, there's a lot more development there than there was, whatever it was that was adopted 20 years ago, but the world has not come to an end. And in fact, congestion has not reached intolerable levels. It's fine. So why do we insist on applying these tests that everybody acknowledges are not going to result in interchanges being built in urban areas or even lane widenings for that matter? And everybody acknowledges that the ultimate goal here is to get an UMP which has a proportional allocation of payments without some kind of mechanism that stops development from occurring. So all we're proposing here is that in the meantime, while you're developing that proportional payment mechanism, just charge people a rate until you figure out exactly what the allocation is, and don't jam up the development process in the name of some, sanctity of the consistency of the system. That's like putting form over substance. Nobody would suggest that we should halt development in downtown Silver Spring because somebody's flunked an intersection congestion test at Georgia and Colesville. And so our recommendation simply recognizes that, says charge them a per trip rate and refine that when you can come up with an UMP. Why not wait until the UMP's developed? Because it's taken us 4 years to get an UMP for Bethesda and we still don't have it. We can't sit around and wait for the UMP to be developed in order to implement the policy that recognizes that these tests, which we've applied in the past, simply don't facilitate the kind of development that we want to see. And so there you have it.
And if I may add just real quickly, I think what Casey has said is an important point, which is kinds of transportation tests that focus on intersections.
Gwen, I don't know if you have a piece of paper over your microphone or anything like that, but it's a little hard to hear you. So.
Okay, well, I'll try to get closer. I don't have anything over, but we are not simply saying abandon these. We're suggesting other tests that relate more directly to the kinds of changes that we can make in red policy areas. A pedestrian test, a bicycle test. And those are the kinds, we aren't, as Casey said, we aren't going to be widening intersections. We aren't going to be widening roads in these red policy areas. So let's focus on the things we can do to improve the congestion that is going to naturally occur in these most heavily developed areas. Doing the transportation test is like checking a box, and we know that the intersections are going to be problematic. And we don't need a consultant to tell us that.
No single development can afford to fix Connecticut and East-West Highway anyway.
Right. And so what we're trying to say is rather than doing these kinds of tests that are more appropriate to where you might have a transportation or road solution, let's do the tests on bikes. Let's do the tests on PHED accessibility and do those kinds of tests to try to improve the situation. It's not that people get off scot-free from doing anything. It's really changing the focus.
That helps a lot. I was missing. Go ahead, Glenn, and then we'll go to Andrew.
Okay, a couple things. First of all, I'm not sure what device there is to just ask developers, require developers just make a payment in lieu of without having an UMP.
I was going to ask that. What would that be?
It doesn't exist. That has to be the council. The development can't pay something which is some kind of a formula unless it's approved by the council in terms of what not every individual thing, but the rate. Secondly, again, missing the point about where this congestion happens. It doesn't usually happen, almost never happens in the middle or in the red policy area boundary. The question is whether you apply the test to development that's in the red areas. So a development in Bethesda or in Silver Spring, let's take that example, is very unlikely to have an effect anyway on Coles Road and Georgia Avenue because there's a whole grid of streets there, and the planning board points this out. It spreads the traffic out. But when you get out of Silver Spring, there are very few gateways coming in, and you have congestion points. You have, Sligo Creek Parkway in Colesville Road. You have, 16th Street and Georgia Avenue. You have around Bethesda, you have the same thing. And those are real congestion, and they're not urban. So it doesn't get in the way of the kinds of walkability or bikeability you want in the urban zones. The idea of the UMP is that, yes, I agree with Casey that it's taken too long to get there, and I know DOT has a lot of stuff on its plate, but I think this is something that will be moved to the forward front, so we can actually have a series of improvements, which we know what the costs will be, we know how to charge developers, they pay and they go, they aren't held up, and that money would go for those improvements as DOT can implement them with the money that's coming in. And even that, frankly, doesn't provide adequate public facilities in timeliness to the development. Development happens a lot sooner, but at least eventually it will get there. So that's where I am.
Let me ask, though, how do we deal with, if we approve the planning board's proposal, conceptually I like it, but how do you deal with the fact that we don't have a per trip fee to charge? So what does the planning board suggest happens in that instance?
Well, you can still establish a per trip charge. You just would not. You would establish an interim rate pending the refinement of the UMP.
So we have a proposal that we would like to see is that for every master plan that you do, the UMP is part of the master plan. You do a transportation analysis, which you're currently doing anyway. So let's just embellish the transportation analysis, put a cost estimate on it, and then when it goes to council, it goes to council with a per trip cost associated with the infrastructure improvements needed for the master plan.
Sure, but that's only prospective. What do we do if we approve this proposal? Then we don't have a way of.
Right.
There's no hook there. There's no hook remaining in certain instances. So again, I want to ask Gwen, Casey, what do you think we could do about that?
Yeah, if I could just say, we are still recommending bicycle, pedestrian, and transit adequacy tests.
So it's those other
And
ones.
we are still saying that for individual development projects, improvements will have to be made to bicycle, pedestrian, and transit.
Okay.
So no one's getting off scot-free. What we are saying is in the red areas, why test for roadway improvements when we know we are not going to make roadway improvements in those areas? There are the gateway issues that Glenn has mentioned, but I am not really aware of a project in a red policy area that has been required to, in the last at least 5 or 6 years that I'm aware of, that has been required to make a major improvement to a gateway intersection.
Right.
So we are doing this test, and it is an act of
Navel gazing.
sort of a philosophical test to sort of identify what the problems are, but it is not necessarily pulling in the money, which is part of the SSP, although not the whole SSP. It's not all about pulling in money.
And the money, any change is
but
made
it-
creditable against the impact tax anyway, right? So actually, fiscally, it's not necessarily an issue. Okay, Chris.
Right, but it would be improvements to the bicycle, pedestrian, and transit adequacy. That's where we want to do the test and get the contribution.
Okay, Chris, and then Andrew,
I
and then.
wanted to say just a couple things. One is I don't think there's any argument that having the tests for the other modes is an important component of this in the red policy areas. I think we're all on the same page with that. Like Gwen just said, that I was going to say, I'm not aware of any project that's been held up because of violating this standard in a red policy area. But there is some proof to the community that that's not happening through having this test. So I think that's a useful piece of this, although it is a lot of work to get to that conclusion for the applicants. The other part that we should be concerned about is many of the red policy areas have a large number of state roads in them. And it doesn't come into play very often for us because we've had a traffic test that's pretty universal in the county, although the standards are different. We've had the test in place that allows the state to defer to the local APF requirements for their access management or access approvals. without that test, we do run some risk that the state would decide they need to see the traffic study to satisfy their own requirements, which is what's in their traffic study guidelines, is that they defer to a traffic test established by the local jurisdiction unless they find that test insufficient. I think the idea of the UMPS it's been very difficult in practice. It is a good policy direction, but it's been difficult in practice for a number of reasons that we don't need to go into now. But I think what Gary mentioned about trying to get the decision points on master plans and UMPS better aligned, like within months of each other rather than 6 months, years, or 2 years, is essential for that program to be effective. I don't know of a good workaround at the moment. We had this debate in 2016. The decision in 2016 was to retain the standard in the red policy areas, and we're revisiting that issue. And there are some legitimate reasons to keep that standard, but it isn't the most productive use of resources, as we've all discussed, and I don't think there's any argument about that.
Well, just speaking, thanks, speaking to the county executive, I think, and speaking to the average citizen since I just joined government, I had thought that the purpose of LATR was to provide some standards before a project went forward that would be required, some sorts of mitigation that were practical and could happen. And I think that's an important principle.
Okay.
You know, you can say pay and go, but you haven't figured out how much to charge. So,
Okay.
so I think that
prioritization that we work that out.
I'm a little confused about this two different voices from the executive branch situation. So I welcome. I can't.
There is one voice. You saw our recommendation. That's a joint recommendation, and we do support the UMPS, but we also would like to move forward and make sure that we get the Bethesda completed. And that's a story of its own. But the UMPS, we do support the UMPS.
Andrew.
And keeping the current standard until we get them.
Okay. I would like to ask anyone who wants to speak to please request to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. I think Ms. Wright made the best point that's been made here. And, you know, I support what she said. And I think the question here is, you know, what do we want? What are we looking for? And what is the goal and the outcome that we are looking to produce? And if there is an issue, if there is a test that we're going to have, do we want that to go towards widening of the road, channelized right turn, an additional turn lane, or do we want it to go towards bike infrastructure or pedestrian safety infrastructure or better crossings? And especially when we're talking about a red policy area, which is put in place specifically for the purpose of creating the urban environment that we're talking about, I think we should be, as a consistency in our public policy, doing everything that we can to push the government and the private sector to invest the resources towards the activities that we most want and that are most reflective of the public policy that we share, which is to move people out of cars to the greatest extent possible and into non-auto driver mode shares, which we just talked about. And so, you know, I think Ms. Wright put it better than anybody else has and better than I will here, but I just wanted to note that, you know, it's not a question of whether or not we're going to test. It's a question of what we're going to test and what does the test accomplish, and what are we prioritizing in urban areas. And if we're not prioritizing walkable, bikeable, safe pedestrian urban communities, then I'm not quite sure what the overall purpose of a red policy area is to begin with.
Well said. Will?
Mr. Conklin, oh, there you are. You moved on me. Okay. You said there are, while not perfect, and I think we're the land of policy and the land of these tests is that we're in the land of imperfection. You said there are some reasons to keep the test in place. Could you enumerate those reasons, several of them for me?
There are several, and let me go through them kind of one by one. there's an overlay of state traffic study guidelines that by having the vehicular performance test that's applied, although with not the same standards, but the same test is applied across the county, it eliminates a concern that the state would start to require separate traffic studies for projects in these areas. The second element is having the intersection performance standard can provide transparency to the public that indeed these things are being evaluated and those standards aren't being violated for individual projects, which is it otherwise becomes an unknown. Third is that having this type of standard has driven some of the considerations in master plans. For example, in the Bethesda downtown plan, this drove the consideration of what the appropriate non-auto driver mode share needed to be. And I think that's an important element of having the vehicular performance standard in these policy areas that is applied both in the study process and in the master planning process. Additionally, many of these projects, as Glenn mentioned, they might be located at the edge of one of these policy areas, and the place where the standard is getting tripped up is maybe not right within it, but at the edge, and there may be the possibility for mitigation at those locations. And there are mitigation strategies that can be evaluated, like changing lane assignments and other things within the existing road sections that would otherwise not get defined and explored if we weren't looking at the vehicular.
Didn't look at it. Okay.
So
And
that's the laundry list, the short laundry list of reasons why we think.
I appreciate that. That's helpful. And I think the public accountability tracking one is, they're all important for different reasons, but that one sticks out to me. We all seem to agree, and I would agree, that the umps are a more elegant solution. We shouldn't go deep into this, but is there a way to speed that process up? I know Mr. Enrich talked about including it with the master planning process, but in the interim, is there that point of the hook? Is there any way to if someone can concisely tell me what's holding that up? No one can answer that.
On Bethesda, as an example, we are waiting for some information from the planning department. We don't know what the denominator is. We have the numerator and what the infrastructure costs are, needs are, but we don't know what the denominator is to divide it by.
Okay.
So we need one piece of information, which should be relatively simple. And the others just are, when the master plans are done, there is a transportation study done, but it isn't at a level of detail and cost estimating to develop the but if we could do that at the same time when all of the data is there and all the analysis is there, it would save quite a bit of time.
Okay.
And Bethesda was the only one that's been funded beyond White Oak. So
Got it. Well, that is not like a long list ready to be done. Yeah, I mean, I think on balance, we should wait. And since there isn't a hook now, there's not a mechanism to collect the fee. The transparency issues that were mentioned, the interface with state road highways potentially. I just think, I would err on the side of hanging on for now and trying to speed up the umps and get that information on Bethesda, get that going, and then incorporating it going forward, like Gary mentioned. But so that's where I'll be on this.
I'd like to go back to Gwen's comment that over the past 4 or 5 years, I'm not sure exactly what time frame she said, that these tests had not resulted in any particular exactions. Can you expand on that, Gwen?
I think what I was really saying is that we have not required, because of these tests, any major road widenings, lane additions, or actions like that. What we have ended up working on, even without, some of our proposed adequacy tests that we're talking about, is we have had people do sidewalk improvements. We've had people add bike lanes. We've had people, provide more robust transportation demand management. I mean, in these red areas, those are the kinds of solutions that are really going to be needed. And those are the ones that we have been requiring in development applications. I do understand the idea about transparency, but I think the other side of it, to be perfectly honest, is that it is a very complicated kind of test. Only the citizens who are most focused and who are transportation junkies follow these tests. That's why I was really pleased that one of the people who is a transportation, junkie, our friends in Colesville, basically agreed with removing this test.
Might be a junkie. These are kind of junky.
Because I think that they saw that they just were not resulting in anything that ended up meaning anything. I mean, we would love our developers to spend their money on giving us more amenities, not on doing more tests that don't result in any improvement.
Okay, so I'm going to summarize what I've heard. The proposal is to close down this particular test, recognizing that it's connected to adding a number of different tests. And so the intent is to shift the policy in urban areas towards testing for different kinds of needs and then aligning the solutions that we're seeking to those needs. That's what I'm hearing, and everybody agrees on that as a direction to go, but that's what I'm hearing. So
I thought it was 2-1.
We hadn't voted yet, but you're probably right.
Yeah.
Is there any? Okay.
Just the only thing I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Glenn.
Just make sure. I mean, again, the council will be revisiting all this stuff and take all these recommendations together. But based on the decision that joint committees made this morning, then this would apply not just to the metro station policy areas, but the entire purple line policy areas as well. So there'd be no test in those areas, those residential areas as well.
There would be
no test. Wayne Avenue, no test. Flower Avenue, Arliss.
Or would they not be subject to these new tests? It would be
because they're in red policy areas now.
Talking about the vehicle test versus the other tests, they would be subject to the pedestrian and bike.
Oh yeah, sure. No, there's a question before the House is whether to eliminate the vehicle test in red areas. And this morning, the joint committees decided, majority 3-2, saying the purple line areas would also be red areas. So that means there'll be no test in those, no motor vehicle test in those areas either. I'd make sure you know when you're
eyes wide open. You're saying.
Well, thank you. Eyes wide open.
Comments on that from planning board?
Yeah, I think Gwen has put it well that we're not going to expand the road network, and so why do we keep applying tests that imply that we should be expanding the road network when that's not going to happen? I think it's true that the public confidence argument cuts both ways, because the problem is the tests are predicated on the assumption that if there's lots of congestion, what you should do is add road capacity. And when that doesn't happen, that just adds to cynicism, because everybody knows we're not going to add road capacity because that would be a terrible idea. So why are we setting up tests that sort of frame the discussion in ways that lead the people who, frankly, don't want to see development happen to point to that and say, well, see, you should have stopped this. You should have rejected this development application. Why would we set ourselves up for that?
Mr. Cochran, I think, is trying to reply to that.
Well, we also learn how to better manage the capacity that's there through these things.
But again, nothing prevents the government from making operational improvements, or for that matter, improvement changes to the geometry of a roadway in order to increase its functionality. This is the SSP is focused, as it's written right now, on the narrow question of, in addition to what the payment should be, should development be allowed to proceed? And I submit to you, nobody in their right mind thinks we should stop development in Silver Spring because of intersection congestion on Georgia Avenue whether it's immediately inside or immediately outside of the plan area. And the fact that we continue to have master plans come through where we're getting, engaged in this fictitious exercise, pretending like we might build an interchange at Cedar Lane by NIH in order to, quote unquote, relieve congestion that's supposedly caused by development in downtown Bethesda, when that everybody knows that congestion is being driven by things that have nothing to do with office buildings or apartment buildings being built in downtown Bethesda, but it's because of background traffic and through traffic. The whole edifice is built on a pile of fictitious assumptions, and we should stop pretending that it makes any sense.
Tell us what you really think, Casey.
I'm just laying it all out there for you. That may not be the politically, savvy argument, but it's true. We are not going to stop development in Bethesda or Silver Spring or White Flint because the intersection delay measure is 125 seconds per vehicle. Of course, we're not going to do that. We shouldn't do it. Nobody would be happy with that result. Not even some of the people who are not enthusiasts for development or growth. And so let's stop creating this system that gives people a club to hit us over the head with for things that are not actually improvements at all, but just expensive and time-consuming analytical exercises that don't result in any change in the world. Instead, let's focus on how we can make these places more walkable, bikeable, and transit-friendly, so we can actually...
This is turning into a filibuster here.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Sorry.
Jeez,
Sorry. He asked for it.
It's okay. It's all right.
I would just say that I don't agree with that perspective.
Mr. Chair, can we just vote? I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
There's three people who have votes on the committee, and we're hearing a lot of commentary from both sides here, and I'm not sure we're convincing anybody of anything besides the people who are speaking, convincing themselves of the positions that everybody already knows.
So 15 seconds.
Yeah.
I'd like to give Chris the last word, and then we'll go to a
Through
vote.
these studies, we did learn about a number of changes to make to county-controlled streets in Bethesda as development was proceeding. They weren't necessarily at the intersections, but they were resulting from the analyses that the developers had to prepare as part of this. And then I'll stop. I know Meredith wanted to say something.
I just agree with our head of DOT exactly, and I mean, I guess I still believe there is such a thing as transportation management, and so.
Thank you.
Well,
I think
Mr. Chairman, just a technical question on then to Mr. Anderson brought up. Then we can still test girls, slow your voice. We can still test. But how do you test? So the government would generate its own study to get the information that Mr. Conklin just talked about that has been useful in other forms. Would you just have to create your own and do it on your own? Is that what would happen if they were eliminated? How would we get that information?
Well, eventually we get the UMP.
Right. So, okay. But we all agree on the UMP. But in the interim,
first of all,
go ahead.
I think that the additional tests we're creating could provide some valuable information about changes that are needed in a given area. Secondly, to your point, I think as candidly we would be relying upon DOT to observe a problem and then decide if it warrants a test and warrants a change, and we would be taking on that responsibility.
Okay, that was my question to Mr. I mean, is that how you would envision it? Maybe you could just nod or say yes, or
Yeah, there's no other way than we'd have to see it occur after the fact and then go try to solve it then.
Which is a consideration. Okay, thank you.
All right, so I think we have 2-1 on that, so we'll proceed to the next item. Is that correct, Mr. Chawando? I think it is, right? Yeah.
Okay, the next item is a little bit of a technical one. It has to do with how to test congestion in the motor vehicle test. And again, this is countywide. It's not just in red areas. For years and years and years, the method that's was used was called critical lane volume, which is a pretty quick and dirty way of figuring out what congestion would be at an intersection in the future. The traffic engineering profession has moved away from that considerably over the last really 20 years, and they moved to more robust forms of measuring this, usually through the Highway Capacity Manual HCM method, which is what the council is using now. in the SSP test for most areas. The test, the way the test is done now, is that for a traffic study that's done wherever, Germantown, Damascus, Albany, North Bethesda, the first cut is whether or not the intersection, actually in yellow and green areas, the first cut is the critical lane volume worse than 1,350, which is a pretty good level of service. If it's worse than that, then you go to the more robust method, which takes more time, but gives you a much more credible result in terms of what the data shows. The planning board is recommending changing that to say that in orange, yellow, and green areas, that the CLV test should be used if and to see whether or not the CLV standard would be exceeded. If it's exceeded, then they would go to the HCM test, look at more robustly. The problem with that is that the CLV test is a very rough measure, and you can get a lot of false positives from that. And so if you have a situation where the critical lane volume measure is pretty close to what the policy area standard is, excuse me, the actual measure of delay could show that it could considerably more than that, or less, but it could go either way. So it is the positive side of doing what the planning board is recommending is that it makes the traffic studies simpler and cheaper. The downside is that it produces probably about half the time results which are not credible and does not measure what needs to be done. So my recommendation is just to remain with the current test. The way of testing, I think the executive agrees with that. Trying to see if anybody else has really weighed in on it. I don't see that anyone has.
All right. Casey, Gwen, can you...
Well, you'll recall that this idea of applying HCM was applied only at the last minute in the last SSP. So we've had, 4 years of experience with it, but it was not applied before then. The entire testing regime for traffic adequacy was based on CLV until 2016, and nobody suggested that it wasn't credible. There was a suggestion that this is more precise, and I would agree that it's more precise, but I think that its very precision is part of the problem. It creates a false sense that because it's more precise, it's getting closer to the truth with a capital T. Precision is not the same as accuracy. Last point I would make about this, in addition to the obvious, I think that Glenn acknowledged that it makes the testing simpler and cheaper, is that this allows you to avoid the more intensive analysis unless you're at the threshold. So I'm not aware that any result of any development application actually changed between 2016 and right now, based on the application of the HCM tests. I do know that it has caused additional, it's an additional regulatory layer of burden on applicants, and it causes additional expense and delay. So unless somebody can point to a specific constructive outcome in some material number of cases, I just don't see that we should look. I think that we tried this experiment over the last 4 years, and it did not produce better results.
Gwen?
I'm sorry, to say Glenn or Gwen?
We're so much alike, it's easy to get us confused.
There you go. There you go. She's the one with red hair.
I don't really have much more to say beyond what Casey said. I think that all of the tests are problematic in one way or another. I think that we had used CLV for a long, long time. We've now had 4 years of experience of using HCM. It hasn't changed a whole lot, to be perfectly honest. And so I think that that's sort of Casey's point. But, I don't think any of us are going to fall on our swords about this. There are two tests And for our orange, yellow, and green areas, we do need to test, and we'll see what your judgment is.
Gary, Chris, yep.
Again,
Go ahead, Gary.
let me unmute first. There you go. I think the issue is not the individual intersection analysis, but the stream of intersections. And HCM gives us the ability to analyze the queue and the flow, whereas CLV is simply one intersection. And so we learn a lot more from HCM. And that's why I think it really helps us if we have to then go and do more signal timing information or other things. I mean, a lot of developers, and this didn't come up in the earlier discussion, if they add enough traffic to add 1 or 2 seconds of delay to an intersection, they can retime the intersection and correct for it probably as a single intersection. And that's what happens a lot in these studies. But when you look at the stream of intersections and look at the flow, you may get a different answer. And so
does this relate to if the decision that we just made, like if we're not testing, remind me, how does this connect?
Well, it works particularly for red areas as well as the other areas, but you get the HCM gives you a stream of an arterial and the flow on the arterial, not just at one particular intersection, which the CLV does. So it's more robust.
But when do you have to take this test? When do you have to use this test now?
Well, I mean, as Glenn said, it's used when you're approaching the threshold of, what was it, 1350?
1350 or higher.
Or higher.
That's something that the county would then monitor. Sorry.
Well, I mean, right now we don't.
Here. Connect me with our previous discussion to this discussion.
Okay, so in the orange. Okay, so if we now go to the orange and yellow areas.
Okay, so it's really we're talking about the orange and yellow areas.
You already talked about the red.
Right, it doesn't change the red area.
Right. I think it is pretty important because you have like Georgia Avenue that's not part of the red area. The flow of Georgia Avenue is pretty important. And if a developer comes in and only looks at, CLV at one intersection, you're really not going to be understanding the problem that may be occurring on Georgia Avenue. You may solve a side street problem. And so that's where I think the HCM really has its benefits. I'm not an expert in it, but that's an area that I think we get more information to help us make better decisions.
So the proposal would have us move from HCM to LCV in orange and red if the previous discussion that we had holds. And that's the question as to whether we want to do that.
One other
Orange and yellow.
Orange and yellow.
Yellow, right, orange and yellow.
we would, if there are pedestrian or other improvements planned at the signals, extending the walk times or other things like that, this methodology allows us to understand those changes where CLV doesn't reflect them.
Okay. I think I'm comfortable sticking with HCM.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Jason, Will, you're Jason? Yeah.
If I just wanted to clarify that today under existing, we apply the 1350 CLV screening in both green and yellow. So really what we're talking about doing here, if we're assuming there's no test at all in the red policy area, this is really only going to apply to the orange then, is adding that CLV as a new screening tool in the orange area because we don't already have it there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, go ahead, Mr. Conklin, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was just saying I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. I think just sticking with the one that provides more data. I know, and it reminded me I need to follow up with DOT on these signalized, the time it takes to cross streets. It's something I've been talking about and to help pedestrians, in fact. So I think the more information, the better.
In light of our previous,
I'm happy to go with the committee here, colleagues here.
All right, Glenn, you got one on the board?
All right. We're not keeping score here. The next issue is the Brt Corridor Standard, the the planning board's recommending loosening the standard along BRT on the roads where BRT would be running in the master plan. 355, Route 29, Randolph Road, Georgia Avenue, etc., to 100 seconds per vehicle, which is, again, sort of midway between orange and was currently the red policy area standard. Let's see who are the development attorneys, Brt and Brewer, support that. Council staff opposes it for a couple of reasons. First of all, recall the discussion about the purple line policy areas. We said this time around it was legitimate to treat the purple line areas differently than there were the other areas around it because they're being constructed within the 6-year period. That's not true with BRT. We don't have a single BRT line other than the US 29 flash service, which is really not the full BRT. It's a proto BRT, if you will. But none of the others are programmed for construction. There's no construction funds at all. So they're not givens in the SSP at all. We wouldn't be counting them. So just on that basis, I would say it's premature to do that. I go further and to say I'm sort of doubtful that it would even be justified in the longer term. And look at the data that I put in the packet on the section. In this section, if you look at the forecast of travel time by BRT versus auto on 355 and on Beers Mill Road, where we have data in terms of the forecasted travel both by cars and by the BRT, you find that in every case the auto travel is faster than BRT. That's different than the purple line. It's certainly different than Metro Rail, where the transit is faster. And so we can argue about whether or not it is ever something that be considered, but certainly now, because none of those projects are programmed within 6 years, should that standard go into effect now. There may be a situation in the future where, like the Corridor Cities Transway point out, if it ends up staying on the master plan alignment, it runs in its own right-of-way, that it could be a faster trip than by car. That might justify in the vicinity of those that line that some of those intersections have a looser standard, but not now. So my recommendation is not to do what the planning board's recommending.
Okay.
And the executive agrees with that, apparently.
See if my colleagues have any questions or comments here.
Yeah, go ahead. Andrew, you can go first.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah, I have mixed feelings on this. I think I get where the planning board was trying to go. Obviously, we need to do everything in our power to make BRT more attractive, to demonstrate our commitment to BRT. It's a major policy priority of the county executives and of this council. I think we're finally moving in the right direction here. I'm excited at some of the progress that we're making, but it is a bit off. And, this is a 4-year policy, and we're, outside of Route 29, even on 355, which I appreciate Mr. Conklin's incredible work on this and that on DOT and our partnership, because it's taken a lot of effort, and it's tough to make a change on something that is beyond the time period of the 4 years, even though I'm philosophically fully with where the planning board was on the fact that we need to be doing everything that we can, taking every opportunity that we have to make BRT and dedicated lanes with BRT, real bus rapid transit, a priority in the county.
This is Eric Gray with the Planning Department, if I could chime in on this point. I think this recommendation, I know this recommendation was largely informed by our experience with the recently adopted master plan for the Beers Mill Corridor. In that context, when we were looking at the question of whether or not the plan worked from a transportation land use balance at a master plan context, and we look at what intersection level of service would achieve that goal, we found that 100 seconds per vehicle was the recommendation that was in the plan and was ultimately adopted by the council. The current standards for those policy areas that Beers Mill traverse, like Kensington Wheaton and Aspen Hill and North Bethesda, the standard range from like 59 seconds in Aspen Hill, it's 71 seconds in North Bethesda, and it's 80 seconds in Kensington Wheaton. But at a master plan context, it didn't. Those standards didn't work for the plan. When we raise it to 100, that's what worked for those signalized intersections. So the question is, why not use Veers Mill as a test case, and having that experience, why not apply that finding countywide? So that's what we've done with this recommendation.
That's interesting.
Can I? Yeah, the 100 second per vehicle rationale for the Veers Mill plan was because of Vision Zero.
Yeah.
And that's the same kind of argument has not been made here. And frankly, actually, this is a question we'll need to resolve amongst the staffs. What is the standard on Veers Mill Road now? Because the standard in the SSP are still those old standards that Eric mentioned. The master plan said that should be changed to 100 seconds per vehicle along Veers Mill Road between the edge of Rockville and Wheaton. I'm not sure what the standard is now, frankly, there. But it was a Vision Zero argument. It wasn't a because BRT is there argument. Because, frankly, BRT is not there.
One thing I would suggest, if the council does not support this recommendation, could we at least put in the growth policy that as individual master plans are done for corridors? Because I will tell you, one of the things coming out of Thrive Montgomery 2050 is that our work program is going to be focused a lot on corridor master plans. And we will probably have additional recommendations that will come up in the next 4 years about, just as we did with Veers Mill, about the congestion standards. That perhaps, if you don't want to do it across the county at this time, at least put in the growth policy that we can update and change those congestion standards based on a master plan. Because I think, as Glenn is pointing out, it's a little unclear right now. We did that in Veers Mill, but we have conflicting information in the growth policy. So if you would like us to do it on a master plan by master plan basis and make these decisions, at least allow us to have those master plans change the growth policy without having to go back and formally amend the growth policy every time we do a master.
Would that require? It makes sense. Would that require legislation? And when you say we're talking about the SSP, you're just stepping ahead on the growth policy. That's what you mean.
Well, right.
I got it, but I'm with you.
But I think, and Glenn can probably address this, if there is a specific provision in the SSP/growth policy that says
support adding the language
that congestion can change.
I'd support adding the language.
I think.
Yeah, I support it too. So I just want to make sure we're clear that we would keep not do the countywide, but support adding this language so that it can be evaluated, like Veers Mill plan.
Let's keep talking about this a little bit more. I think we can all agree on what we just discussed, that under any circumstance we want to have this available to us in the future, not to have to jump through an additional process or something like that.
You could make it self-executing. The language in the SSP could say the standard is X, except where a relevant master plan says it's Y. And that way you don't have to come back and amend the SSP. The SSP would effectively incorporate the master plans by reference.
Which I always thought was the standard anyway. I always thought that the master plan reigned. But I don't mind having belts and suspenders, and having confusion, doesn't help anybody. So, I mean, this is a huge policy, that everybody focuses on. So, it's a good suggestion. Another good point by Ms. Wright, who's got a lot of points on the board at this meeting, as far as I'm concerned. And, I think we should include language. I'm not sure exactly what the language is. Maybe we could flesh it out here or even after the fact and bring it back.
It makes sense to do that because the SSP is about staging master plans, and so if a master plan says something, then that's what should reflect in the SSP. That's sort of we had that reverse problem with the very first issue we brought up this afternoon about the NADMS, because master plans are saying, like in the case of Friendship Heights, it's 39% is the master plan goal. Can the SSP change the master plan? Probably not. So unfortunately, but in this particular issue, I think it works to your advantage.
All right. Now, let me give this planning board proposal one more chance here. Gwen, help me understand why this is good for BRT to loosen up this congestion standard in the corridor. My colleagues are laughing at me, I know, but I just go back, make it simple here. Like, so a project is coming in and they have a lower standard, and why is that helpful to BRT?
Well, you're going to be seeing in Thrive Montgomery that our whole focus is adding additional density at missing middle levels and above along corridors. It's all about the corridors. And I think that the goal with this is to help simplify the process to allow for this kind of growth along corridors where BRT will be. It's always a chicken and egg issue with transit. You can say we're going to wait till the transit exists before we take into account the new development and so forth. Or you can say you need some new development to make it more likely that the transit along that corridor gets priority and gets built. So what we were trying to do here was create a slight incentive, so to speak, to and more flexibility to allow that kind of development along corridors where we will have transit eventually. We know the BRT isn't going to come in tomorrow, but it is a chicken and egg kind of issue. If you end up with incentives to create more density along corridors, it will become a higher priority to build that BRT. It's rare that you build the transit and then all the development shows up. There's a mix of chicken and egg, and then egg and chicken kind of situation.
There's actually a middle ground that exists right now and has existed for years, which is that we don't wait for transit to be open and operated to be counted. We wait till it's actually fully funded for construction within 6 years. And so that's the rule we talked about earlier about the purple line. So I think that's because once it's fully funded construction, you really know you're going to get it.
Right.
Now, will it take longer than 6 years? Yeah, projects get delayed all the time. We've counted some projects. Montrose Parkway was funded, and it's no longer in the CIP, so we approved a bunch of development we shouldn't have. But nevertheless, particularly when the public officials really want to push forward a project, and there's fair consensus for it. If it gets to the point where 355 BRT, for example, a section of it is programmed in 6 years, then it's legitimate to do the kind of things folks are talking about.
But one of the problems we have in the development review process is that with these lower congestion standards, when we do LATR, because these are the areas that do run through the orange and yellow areas, we are requiring turn lanes. We're requiring
I don't want to interrupt you.
decel, widening, and that is going to make it harder.
That's the issue. All right, now I understand. I think this is what Casey was saying earlier. That the consequence of the congestion standard is that you sort of continue your suburban strode kind of transportation changes, and then that ultimately is a self-fulfilling problem, makes it less likely that you have a corridor that succeeds as an urbanized corridor where BRT works. And so that's the kind of problem you're trying to get at.
Right.
I feel like this is a little bit of a consequence. Glenn's chuckling, but I feel like this is a little bit of a consequence of not allowing Park and Planning to give us a presentation about their proposal right off the bat. We haven't really taken this up. We just haven't. So, in any event,
Mr. Conklin's been trying to politely get in and say something. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know exactly how to respond to this proposal because I don't know what the outcomes will be. I understand the intent, but I think there's also likelihood of the unintended consequence here. The approach that had been floated earlier where if these corridor plans are developed consistent with the facility plans for BRT that we're putting together so that those are aligned. I think that's a really good strategy to achieve this goal. I am concerned, yes, the anti-congestion measures may be counter to implementing the BRT, but the increasing traffic congestion also makes it harder for us to do BRT. So it's a very complicated set of issues, and
That was the other half of that. Yeah.
Together in a thoughtful way, rather than taking the example from one corridor that's very unique and trying to say that that's how all the corridors are going to perform.
All right. Well, I think we'll probably take a pass on this for now. But we're going to keep working on this whole policy. So if the planning board really feels strongly and they want to come talk to us, we can always revisit that.
Can I clarify? Is take a pass on taking a vote, or taking a pass on want to come back to this later? Or?
No. I think
pass on the recommendation. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay.
That means we're accepting the staff recommendation, not the planning board recommendation.
Correct.
And we're adding the language that planning staff, that Ms. Wright suggested, on clarifying regarding master plans.
Okay.
And again, if planning really feels strongly about this, we've got a month or so. Now, I really do want to hear from the planning team about these next set of tests. I'd like to hear them explain it first.
And I know my limits, so I'm really going to ask our staff to talk about this. And I don't know if David Anspacher or Jason or Eric would like to chime in about the bicycle adequacy test.
Well, so I'll start, and then I'll hand off to Eric to talk about some more of the details of the test. But just to say that ultimately what the planning board was looking to provide here was some additional scoping to the tests. Whereas right now we have one set of scoping standards that say here's when these tests are required. Now we would have multiple, or we'd have two, one at 50 peak hour peak hour person trips, and another at 100 peak hour person trips. So the more person trips a development application is anticipated to create and generate, then the larger the scope of the test that they need to conduct. So that was one of the changes. The other change was, what part of that was the idea is if a development is conducting the motor vehicle test, that they should be conducting the full suite of tests. And so right now what we had previously was this 50 peak hour person trip threshold for motor vehicles. Now we're saying we're going to apply that to all of these other tests as well, as opposed to what was in there previously were trips thresholds related to the specific mode of travel. So you had to have, for the pedestrian, you had to have 50 peak hour non-motorized trips. Now we're saying 50 peak hour person trips of any type would trigger the pedestrian trip. So the pedestrian test. So more tests are going to be conducted under what the planning board has recommended. I don't know, Eric, if you want to get into, or as we tackle each one of these, I think the first one is the bicycle. Is that the first one, Glenn?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So Eric, if you want to maybe detail
There's 3 tests, right? You got bicycle, transit, and pedestrian. Is that right?
That's today, bicycle, transit, and pedestrian, and the planning board has also recommended including a safety system test.
Safety system test. So let's hear about what the tests are. I'm sure there are some people saying, goodness, you're talking about 4 new tests.
Well,
they're not 4.
It's one.
Three of them exist, but they would be made. The scope would be broadened. It would be made more. There would be more exactions as a result. The 4th one, the safety test, is the one that doesn't exist at all.
So those people will be wrong. Okay.
Right. So the
I don't know who they are, but they were mistaken.
Well, they will make themselves known.
Okay. Well, this is Eric Ray with the Planning Department. We have, as mentioned before, we have several non-motorized vehicle tests: the bicycle test, the transit test, and the pedestrian test. All of these tests are described in detail in our LATR guidelines. The pedestrian test really looks at is based on looking at pedestrian level of service in terms of crosswalks, in terms at the various intersections. And there's a level of service D criteria that must be met in order to determine whether or not you're adequate at the crosswalks. That's within the scope of the development application. We also have a transit test that looks at transit service feeding into the area, and we look at criteria that's established by the Transportation Research Board that looks at transit capacity for transit lines, particularly as they enter into urbanized areas. And so we use that basic criteria to determine what is adequate or not. And then we have a bicycle test that looks at, really pivots off of the work we've already done in the countywide bicycle master plan, and looking at the whether or not we have a adequate, let's say, a mid-level of bicycle level of service for the average bicycle user, and whether or not that particular standard is met within the development application area. So that's just sort of a high-level overview of the tests that are looked at. And so that's really in the current construct that's also done in concert when it's applicable with the motor vehicle test that we talked about at length earlier. And then we're also proposing adding an additional test called a safety system test that would largely use a tool that's currently under development, a predictive safety analysis tool that looks at predicting where crashes would occur within the scope of the development application, and making a judgment as to whether or not that determination can be made in terms of whether or not the anticipated crashes that would occur would need to be mitigated or not. So that's basically a high-level overview in terms of what we're talking about at this time.
I think we need to get into the weeds here, unfortunately, because there are some significant differences in the current test versus what's proposed. So if we can take them sequentially, the bicycle system test currently looks, as Jason said, looks at those developments that have generate 50 peak hour non-motorized trips, so the trips that are not made by driving. And it would apply to those developments, and it would require that the developer provide a level of travel stress, LTS, I hope I said that right, level 2, which is basically not too uncomfortable, at distances up to 750 feet in each direction from the site. That's the current test. The proposed test from the planning board would apply it not to 50 peak hour non-motorized trips, but at two different levels, as Jason mentioned. One is 100 peak hour person trips. Well, 100 peak hour person trips is roughly the same as 50 peak hour non-motorized trips in a place like Silver Spring or downtown Silver Spring, downtown Bethesda, where the non-auto driver mode share, coming back to that again, is about 50%. So that's really the same thing. There, really, the test wouldn't be much different than what it is now. The difference really is in the orange and yellow areas, where the non-auto driver mode share is considerably less than 50%. In those cases, a lot more developments would be required to meet the 750 foot in each direction standard. And again, they're not building necessarily bikeways 750 feet in each direction on every direction, because there may be some existing bikeways which meet the level of service test for bikes already. But for those that are missing, those missing gaps, they'd be required to build it as part of meeting that test. And again, the planning board is also recommending a second level for those trips that are generate between 50 and 99 person trips in the peak hour. And they would be required to make these kind of improvements over half the distance, 375 feet in each direction. Where the executive and New York DOT to this date really haven't commented on the proposal. Perhaps they actually did in Ms. Wellington's message last night. I have to go back and look. Lurch Brewer actually proposes going with the planning staff's test, which is a little different in terms of the scope, and it just applies to the 100 or more trips, or actually applies to a different measure, 5 peak hour bicycle trips or more. Their point that is in places like Albany, Germantown, Clarksburg, Cloverly, etc., you're not going to find that many bike trips. And so why should there be a requirement to provide bike facilities if there's very few, if any, bikers? There's one more further aspect to this one test, which is that the current test would say you'd have to do 750 feet, but within, as long as it's from a distance from a school and what did I forget? Reading my own packet here. Basically from a school and a bike share station, that was it. And both the planning staff and planning board's recommendation would get rid of that restriction. It would be 750 feet or 375 feet, depending on the size of the development, regardless of whether it's close to a bike share station or a school. My recommendation is kind of close to the planning staff's proposal, which is where it's 5 peak hour bicycle trips or more, that they have to meet this tighter standard, except that it should be limited to those areas within a quarter mile, but not just a school, a bike share station, but also a public library and a recreation center. So there you have the full panoply of proposals before you.
It triggered me, Glenn. The comment that why should we provide more bike facilities if there aren't a lot of bikers there? That's why we don't have a lot of bikers there. I think.
Not necessarily. It depends on the length of the trip. As been pointed out several times, bike trips tend to be not the short trips that walkers do, but not the longer trips that most commuters do. There are, very active bikers who do travel long distances. For most of them are actually for trips of, and planning staff, please correct me, I think it was something like around 2 miles to 2.5 miles or so, maybe a little longer, but not the longer trips. So certainly in urban areas, the red areas, and probably a lot of the orange areas, you're absolutely right, Mr. Reamer, but when you get out into the yellow and the green, different story.
Okay. Casey had indicated his interest in saying something. Andrew, did you want to go first, or did you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to hear, the different perspectives. I'm a little torn on this because, creating unnecessary costs that hurt us in terms of our ability to be competitive is part of the whole purpose of this. What is adequate infrastructure and what is appropriate infrastructure. But at the other end of it, as we talk about creating the type of county that we want, in many cases it's outside the urban areas where the bike infrastructure is needed the most. You think about just outside of a red policy area, in many cases that's the area where we have some of the worst infrastructure, where it's needed the most desperately in order to actually have any shot at meeting the non-owner driver mode share. And all the major corridors, certainly in my district heading into Bethesda are good examples. Bradley Boulevard and Old Georgetown Road and beyond. But there are many examples, all around the county, Silver Spring, Germantown, et cetera, where that infrastructure is challenged. And I think we sometimes do a good job of creating the infrastructure in the master plan itself in the urban area, but not enough to connect folks to those urban areas. And so I will admit this one's a little bit tough for me, so I'd like to hear from planning and hear from staff and see if we could grapple with, we don't want to do more, require more tests than are needed to accomplish what we want, but I also would hate for us not to be looking to get the type of infrastructure that we have talked so frequently about that we need, particularly in the areas where I seem to think that we most need it.
Casey.
Yeah, I think I can speak directly to that. On the point about unnecessary costs, obviously we've tried throughout this SSP review to try to simplify the process. That's one of the reasons why we made some of the recommendations about the traffic test. But on this point, remember that there will have to be a traffic study regardless. So if you have to retain Wells and Associates or, West Gucker or somebody like that because you need them to perform an HCM analysis, that's a quite elaborate analytical exercise. That's where most of the expense is going. To ask them to then tack on analysis of the bike and pedestrian infrastructure is really marginal, since you don't have to retain a separate consultant. These firms can do all of the analysis for all the modes as part of the project. So I don't think there will be much, if any, additional cost to roll the bike and pedestrian analysis into the overall traffic study. Now, the other thing I want to point out about additional costs, and this is what I've heard a lot from our friends in the real estate community, as it's sometimes referred to. They've said, well, oh my God, don't make us do these tests because then we're going to be asked to do a lot of expensive improvements. That's a separate question. I certainly agree that we should not ask for drastic, expensive, resource-intensive improvements from small projects in suburban or exurban locations. But that's a different question than whether or not we should do the test in the first place to identify what improvements may be necessary. And as Mr. Friedson pointed out, it's Old Georgetown Road, it's Bradley, it's 118 and some of the roads in Germantown. There are some very substantial projects in Germantown that would not have to go through the test at all if we were to adopt the staff's recommendation as opposed to the planning board's, because of the difference in the travel behavior. And as Mr. Friedson pointed out, some of these roads are extremely dangerous, and we've had a number of people, of high school students, killed on Germantown Road over the last few years because they're trying to walk from Seneca High School over to Germantown Dunn Center or just get around the neighborhood. These are not places that are out in the middle of nowhere. They are places that have a lot of destinations, a lot of trip generators, a lot of younger people trying to get around. And so I think that we can do that and do it in a way that's not particularly burdensome or costly, especially, and this ties me into something that's in the staff report that also DOT seems to support. They said, well, we don't need to do these tests or studies because we already have the information from the bike plan, the pedestrian plan, the vision and zero analysis the planning department's currently carrying out, and some of DOT's analysis. If the applicant wants to stipulate that those sources of information are sufficient and the planning staff agrees, then we can certainly provide that they don't have to go through an additional level of analysis with some third-party, contractor to go study the issue again. But if you don't have the requirement that the test is done, then you can't impose any exaction, even for something as simple as a crosswalk, in order to improve conditions for the safety of bicyclists and pedestrians near the project. So we can do it in a way that's not particularly burdensome. It's only going to be additive to things that they're already doing. And if there's concerns about what the cost of actually making the improvement are, let's deal with that in terms of applying a proportionality restriction and not saying let's avert our eyes and pretend like the test it shouldn't be done or that there's no need to make improvements in the first place.
All right. Meredith, I saw you raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. Well, we did make a comment on that, and also DOT wants to speak to this too, that basically we saw this as a problem of the master plan. And normally from my planning experience, when a project comes in, if there is a master planned bike path nearby, the planning board would ask them to contribute to it, and as Casey said, there'd have to be proportionality. But the county executive is just concerned about adding all these tests and increasing the cost of development, both slowing it down and increasing the cost of the development, because I don't know how much 1,500 feet of bike path costs, but depending on where you are and the grade and all that good stuff, it can be very expensive. So to me, right now, there's not enough judgment added to whether this is a good idea. It's one size fits all. You have to do it. And it's a big expense. So, or at least we need to know that. I don't know that. But I think, if you're going to give up on these other tests because you're trying to loosen up things, I think the county should think twice then about adding all these extra things, these very, more niceties that can slow down projects.
Well, I don't think bike safety is a nicety and pedestrian safety is a nicety. And, I'm concerned about a perspective that wants to increase costs for everything except for biking and pedestrian safety, which is frankly what the testimony we've received today shows. An eagerness to raise taxes in the red areas, an eagerness to impose more costly tests, except for one area, and that's when bikes and pedestrians are involved. Interesting framework.
I certainly agreed to not try to do tit for tat. But all I would say is that I think just speaking, let's just be fair about it. We don't know what these costs are. And of course, we're all concerned about pedestrian safety and bike safety. But, I saw the CIP. It says the bike master plan is priced at $3 billion. So that is a concern.
Now you are getting far afield now. Okay.
But we're trying to get developers to pay for that.
The only thing I would add to the discussion is, when developers do bike and pedestrian facilities, they usually come forward to our department and they want a credit on their impact tax. And so the key is this a net zero sum game? The nice thing is hopefully we are getting facilities built, which is very important for safety and for access and mobility. But it's not contributing to the overall better cause of pedestrians and bicycles and the bigger picture because of the credit.
Making localized, it could be that a project makes localized improvements and gets a credit, whereas without making those localized improvements, they'd pay more impact. More of their exaction would be in the form of impact tax, and less would be in the form of a localized improvement for bike and pedestrian safety. I don't know what to make of that.
I don't know either. It's the point that of the projects that do come forward, they do come ask for impact tax credits.
Right. Well, they're entitled to it.
Therefore, it's not costing them anything hypothetically, but yes, we are getting improvements.
So,
an example. I'm sorry.
I was just sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to ask for a clarification of that point. So are you saying whether it's the planning board staff recommendation or the planning board recommendation, you don't see it making a meaningful impact to pedestrian safety improvements? It's a question of whether it's localized or not. Is that the point that you're making?
Well, I think it depends on the order of magnitude of the improvement. If they're doing a block face of improvements and there's nothing else around it, then it's probably not going to be useful for a long time.
So let me pause you on that, because that was one thing that did come to my mind. So Casey, can you, if we have a full protected bike lane network, the development goes in, and are you going to make them build one block of a protected bike lane network? That would seem to be not necessarily the best use of money.
No, and we always consider that, whether or not there's some, logical terminus. But I think it's just flatly wrong to suggest that there's this impact tax trade-off that's being suggested, because yes, it's true, developers come and ask DOT for credit, and DOT usually says no, because the standard is whether it adds capacity. And DOT routinely argues that adding a bike lane does not add capacity.
That's actually not true. A developer has by right to get a credit against the impact tax if he builds a bikeway which meets the requirements of the impact tax law, which is if it's a separated trail or if it's a separated bikeway. If they're actually just putting down paint and striping something, that may not be. But if they're building certainly a separated bikeway or a trail, they absolutely do. And I'll give you an example. In Cabin Branch recently, there was the development out there was required to build a master plan bikeway. It goes from nowhere to nowhere. But they were required to do it because it's in the master plan. Because of the bicycle master plan that was approved a couple of years ago. And they get a credit. And they got a credit. And it was not, by the way, Meredith, it's not $3 billion, it was $5 billion. But anyway, for the master plan. But never.
We appreciate the facts being accurate. We also appreciate the county executive's newfound interest in the cost of development in Montgomery County. So that's very helpful.
So Gary's point is correct. But that's neither here nor there about whether or not you have this test.
I'm still concerned. I mean, could we hear from planning staff? I mean, we have two standards here. There's a question of practically what's the difference between them in terms of policy. Could we hear the rationale behind the planning staff standard versus the planning board standard, and then decide what the committee prefers and vote on it?
Well, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, sure. So what we went to the planning board with originally was 100-person trip threshold. And then in planning board discussions, they indicated that they wanted some of the scoping. So that was when we developed this 50-person trip where you were required to look at half the area. And at the 100-person trip, we required the full test, which is pretty much consistent with what we have today in terms of what you have to look at. So it was just what the planning board has added in was that scoping scale. But then what we were recommending, planning staff was recommending, was a mode-specific requirement that it had to be at least 5 trips, peak hour trips of that particular mode, so that it was kind of like a de minimis, right? So in this case, bicycle trips, you had to. So it was 50-person trips of all modes, but we said a 5 bicycle trip threshold to ensure that we weren't requiring an application that was only going to generate 1 or 2 bicycle trips to do this test. The planning board chose not to go with that. They just wanted to kind of keep it standard across all of the different tests at the 50 and 100. And you'll see we use that 50 and 100 all the way through.
Another, I guess, option is that you could have a bifurcated test where in the red and orange areas, you do require it as the planning board's recommending, but in the yellow and green areas, you go with the 5-trip standard. That way you don't get situations where, like Jason just mentioned, where you might have development in not everything in the county is urban. In the real suburban area where there's very few bike trips that will happen just because of the nature of the land use, not necessarily because of the lack of bicycle infrastructure. And we're talking about commuting trips here for the most part, peak hour trips. Perhaps you could even do that. Just have a 2 tests depending on which color you're in.
So that would be.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just to say that again, that the bifurcated strategy would be in the yellow and green areas, which are, more. Sorry.
Somebody living in the yellow area is calling you, I think.
Yeah. I don't know why.
Well, it would be helpful to state for the record what the different standards would be.
Okay, so again, in what the planning staff had proposed was if a development generates at least 5 peak hour bike trips, 5 peak hour bike trips, that they would be required, and it was 100 peak hour trips in total, person trips in total, and 5 of them were peak hour bike trips, that they would be required to provide 750 feet of bikeway in each direction from that site to make sure that all the bikeways within 750 feet, I should say it that way, meets this level of traffic stress standard of LTS 2. Again, there may already be some bikeways that exist like that, but others not. They have to fill in the gaps. The planning board is saying that when there's 100 peak hour trips of any kind, just total, that you have to provide 750 feet in each direction. And if there are 50 to 99 peak hour trips, you'd have to provide 375 feet in each direction. So the shorthand version of it is the planning staff would only hit the medium-sized and larger developments. The planning board would hit not the smallest, but a smaller set of developments.
Can you explain the size a little bit more? Like, translate this trips to actual size of a project.
I
think the planning board may have had some charts when they went over this, at least if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we pull that up, Jason?
I'm going to look for them. All right.
Mr. Sartori loves charts and data, so we appreciate that.
It might be a second, so yeah, I'm going to go video silent here for a second, but feel free to keep talking.
Don't worry, they will.
And the number of peak trips, can we just explain in the two different standards that we're talking about, just so everybody's on the same page here? We have 5 peak hour
bicycle trips. That's one. That's the planning staff's.
Go
ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Sorry.
And then the other standard would be 100 peak hour person trips. In other words, just people traveling, regardless of.
That would be the green and yellow.
No, that would be the. If you bifurcated, I would say that would be the one you'd use for red and orange, and use the 5 peak hour bike trips for yellow and green.
So I think we're interested to know what 5-person peak hour translates to as far as development size. If you have more information, that's great. But
I'm a little confused though. Why wouldn't we, rather than having 2 different standards, total trips and peak bike trips, why wouldn't we have the same standard, peak bike trips, and just have it be 5 in certain areas and a different number in another area? I mean, it seems to me that would be a less confusing way, 5 and 15 or 5 and 20. I mean, I don't know what the number is, 5 and 10, 5 and 25. I mean, I think,
you could do
policy
that.
experts who know more than I would and the practical implications of what that means could help here. But it seems to me it'd be a much more coherent policy if it didn't change the standard of what type of trip we're even talking about between the different policy areas.
You're absolutely right, Mr. Friedson. That would be better. And one advantage of the planning board's proposal is that it's much easier to project, to forecast how many person trips are being generated than try to figure out how many person trips by mode, like how many of those people are going to take a bike versus, taking transit versus walking versus driving. So, I mean, you could even go back to saying that maybe it is person trips you look at, but have a different standard for yellow and orange. Maybe it's not 100 peak person trips. Maybe it's 200 person trips in the yellow and orange before something this comes into play. I mean, there are different ways you could cut this.
I don't feel strongly what the standard is, but I do think we should be consistent with what the standard is, because I think it'd be much easier for folks to understand if we do go the route of bifurcating that.
Person trips are
subject matter experts who know more about this than I do and what the implications would be.
Right. Jason, have you found it yet?
I am still looking.
Okay. Do you want to go to the
Mr.
transit
Chen,
test?
are there things
to
that we can move to that are
I
more?
suppose we can come back here.
Why don't we do the transit test? Because I don't think that's as complicated. Then come back to the bike test.
All right.
The transit test, again, went into play in 2016, the first time. And the test now says that you look at bus stops or bus stations within 1,000 feet of the site. And if any of the buses are operating with 25% or more of the people on the bus standing, in other words, as all the seats are filled and there's 25% or more standing, then that's a problem. And the developer needs to provide a solution to that, either by effectively buying another bus to put on the route, or at least providing the money for buying another bus and for operations. So I'm hearing some background noise. I'm not sure who that is.
Yeah, if you're not talking, could you please mute?
So the planning, over the last 4 years, there actually, as I pointed out earlier, there's actually been nobody who's been required to do that. No one's met the standards. The planning board is recommending tightening the test. Again, as Jason mentioned, all these tests, they want to go with the 50 peak hour person trips. They still would look to 1,000 feet from the site and to see whether or not this overcrowding is possible. And the 50 person trips is actually is different than the current test, which is 50 peak hour riders. So 50 person trips is a peak hour. If only a third of the people are taking transit, you can see essentially increasing the scope by 3 times. And as they did with the other tests, they have a sort of intermediate test for trips that are generated between 50 and 99 peak hour person trips, where you look 500 feet away rather than 1,000 feet. My recommendation is basically just, frankly, bag this test entirely. It's not a transit system test, really. It's a bus system test. It doesn't look at Metro Rail. It doesn't look at Light Rail. It doesn't look at MARC. It just looks at the bus service that's going through the area. And it fundamentally misses the main point of how buses operate, which is when they start at the beginning of the line, there's very few passengers on board. And they only really get full in the last mile or two, if that, of their destination, usually a metro station. And so to require a developer, say in an orange area, to provide the cost of an additional bus, which can run, if it's an electric bus, you're talking close to $900,000, plus the operating costs of that bus, to basically eliminate overcrowding in that last mile or so, it doesn't seem to be worthwhile spending the money. Secondly,
clarifying question.
Sure.
Let's say the project is 3 miles from, let's say, your Germantown development, several miles away from the Germantown Transit Center. A bus gets it gets overcrowded as it approaches the transit center. It's not overcrowded when it's proximate to the development. Is that still required to mitigate?
You look at it. We're at the bus stop that's within 1,000 feet.
It's within 1,000 feet.
Yeah. So if they all actually look at all the bus stops within 1,000 feet, and if any of them have a bus which is overcrowded by that extent, they have to mitigate it either by buying a bus or paying DOT to effectively buy a bus. No one
to date has purchased the bus. No one to date has failed the test. And
why is that?
Well, go ahead, Gary.
I don't know why it is. I'm assuming that the standard of 125% capacity hasn't been met on the routes where it's been tested. So a bus, a normal 40-foot bus, has say 45 or 50 seats. So you'd need to have another 10 or 15 people standing after all the seats were filled. And even though we have routes that are congested, they haven't been in the places where the studies have been done for the development.
The other thing that's important to note is that DOT and WMATA for Metrobus, they change the routes 3 times a year. And part is to address problems exactly like this. If they have a route that's overcrowded and that others that are not nearly well as supported, they'll move the buses around to try to meet that demand. And so it's a dynamic situation. It's unlike the bike and the pedestrian and the roadway situation where you have infrastructure that's, it's either there or it's not. The bus service changes constantly.
A good example, let me just use, is the Route 46, which goes up and down Rockville Pike and stops at from Montgomery College down to Medical Center. It's a pretty popular route. And I ride it frequently, and it fills up in between the stations. So it fills up in Rockville going to Twinbrook, and then at Twinbrook people get off. It fills up again, then going towards Grosvenor, White Flint, and then Grosvenor. And so it's hard to measure this because you have such turnover of the seats on the bus. So I think just efficient operations are such that you do want to have people standing at some time for those short
This is
trips.
all creditable against the impact tax at the end of the day, right?
Buying a bus would.
Is, yes.
So in one, like if we would make somebody buy a bus, and then a month later we're adjusting that route and we're solving that problem, and then we didn't, maybe we didn't even need to make them buy a bus, but we could have used that $1 million for a bus, or we could have used it for something else. I mean, I think that's kind of
Yeah, and they could have used that and that money, and regardless whether the bus is needed anymore, they do get a credit against the impact tax. The other thing is,
what does an adequacy test on this mean? I mean,
the point I think
is, we talk about how hard it is to measure. How is it measured?
It's
measuring
it's measuring standings. It's quality of the ride. So if the idea is that 25%.
I understand, but we're talking about the additive of the development. So how do we determine? Like, I imagine that's just a calculation, right?
Right.
Yeah. If they add.
And so how
trips,
cumbersome is this test really? I mean, that's what I'm getting at here. I mean,
the current test probably isn't very cumbersome because no one's
I don't mean
to do
the cumbersome of what the result. That's the result of the test, which is, do you have to buy the bus because you've pushed things over the edge of 125%, which obviously doesn't happen very often because we don't have a lot of bus routes where they're at capacity or close to capacity, and we move them, to your point, which makes sense. It's a flexible, that's why it's such. It is transit. I want to be very clear. I don't want it's starting to hear some diminishing of buses as transit. Buses are transit, just to be very clear. And it is the formal policy of Montgomery County that buses are transit. And I don't want to have any confusion, about that. But how do we measure, what is the actual? So I'm just trying to get a sense. Is this actually that cumbersome? I mean, are we really talking about something that's so serious? Are we just looking at the ridership on the buses at the closest within 1,000 foot bus stop, and then doing some basic calculation based on the number of people in the building that's going to be generated, and you put it on a piece of paper and you submit it with your signature on it? I mean, that doesn't seem like it's stopping development from happening here.
The study is
huge cost.
The study itself is not cumbersome. What may be cumbersome is particularly if you expand the scope of this, so that many more developments would be, will suddenly have to meet this test. Is that still a worthwhile thing to do? To require developer to
pay? But are we suggesting doing that here?
Yeah. This changes the standard from. Bear with me. I lost my track here. The current test is 50 peak hour riders, transit riders, from a development to 50 peak hour trips. Person trips.
Okay, let me take a step back on all the town. The pedestrian test, which we're going to get to next, the transit test, the bike test that we have not disposed of yet in terms of voting. I'm a little bit confused as to why we just don't have one standard. I think all three tests are appropriate. We have to focus on bike and pedestrian and transit if we want to be serious about our Vision Zero goals and the type of community that we're trying to build and trying to create, and that we're all working so hard to move towards. And we have to be serious about that. And we have to be consistent about that. What I don't really understand is why each test would have a different standard. Why don't we just have the number of trips, period, for a development, whatever that threshold is, the size of a certain size of development that garners this, because we think it would have a meaningful impact on pedestrian, bike, and transit, and then have the three tests. It seems odd to me that we would have three different types of tests, three different standards for the test. Maybe we're going to split up between policy areas of which type. Maybe we're going to switch how we calculate them between which type. Some of them are total trips. Some of them are specific to the type of trip of the test. I mean,
I think the answer, Mr. Friedson, is that if it's let's say it's 100-person trips and you apply that everywhere, or 50-person trips, doesn't matter. In a place like Bethesda, on the bike side, you probably will have at least a certain number of those people riding a bike, maybe 5, maybe 6, 7, 8. Maybe not even that many, really. That's a huge percentage. But you take that same 50-trip threshold in a place like Olney, you're not going to get that. But you'd be requiring the same result in both cases. That's the difference.
Okay, so again, I am fine if we say, okay, on all of these things in red and orange policy areas, here's the total number of trips that is appropriate for the context of those policy areas, and you have to do these 3 tests. And in different policy areas, we set a different standard. But the idea that we would have different standards, different numbers, I mean, it's not coherent public policy. I mean,
well, the standards
unless I'm missing
will be
something and there's a compelling reason not to be consistent, I will never understand the reason and justification for being inconsistent.
Well, I think, are you mentioning?
I'd love to hear Mr. Sartori's points here too, but go ahead.
I was going to say if you're saying the scoping should be the same, the scope of which
the
developments.
threshold. You say the threshold. I would call it a threshold. The threshold that you would meet to require a trip should be. I'm fine if it's context specific, where we say orange and red have one standard that might be different, but the idea that we would have like 19 different combinations of what gets calculated and how and when and where. I mean, I've been reading up on this and studying it, and I recognize it's my first subdivision staging policy, but I couldn't explain this to anybody in terms of what test qualifies where based on whom. And I think we could create a policy that everyone is comfortable with, that meets our goals, that is much more consistent and coherent, and that achieves what we're looking to achieve here. I think we've overcomplicated something that to me is not that complicated. Mr. Sartori?
Sure. So if I could share my screen, I found the spreadsheet. And I will say that I think what Mr. Friedson is expressing is really what the board was trying to achieve in coming up with the standards pretty much for all 3 of those modes, for transit, bicycle, and pedestrian, setting them at the 50-person trips and the 100-person trips, right? Standardizing when they would be required. Once you trigger that, you have to do all of them, as opposed to having different thresholds for different modes. Now, so what you're looking at here, as we were deliberating this with the planning board, we received this from Wells and Associates, a transportation consulting firm, and the numbers seem to check out. So this is kind of what we were using. So I'll show you here, and I'll kind of get to Dr. Orland's point too. This is for Bethesda CBD. This shows you to get to 100-person trips, or 49, so getting pretty much to 50-person trips. Here's some examples. So in this case, we're talking about 165 high-rise apartments will get you to, in Bethesda CBD, will get you to 100-person trips, and how that would be split up between auto, transit, bicycle, and pedestrian. So you can see that bicycle in this case is generating 17 bicycle trips. This project would generate 17 bicycle trips as part of that 100. So you can see there are different ways to get to that 100 depending on what type of development it is. So this is for 50. Now I'm just going to jump now to Olney. We have Olney in here as well. So when we look at Olney, to get to 100-person trips, it's mostly going to come in the form of auto. So those, again, 165 apartments, you're only looking at 6 bicycle trips out of that.
Okay. I would like to request that we have a recommendation from planning staff, council staff, some combination of the two, maybe both separately, which would be fine by me, but on one standard for trips, which could be based on policy area for all of the tests, for all 3 of the tests. I think we could take the safety test separately because that's a new standard, and we can discuss and decide on that. But total trips, because the purpose here is, what is the size of the development to require a series of tests that are looking at key priorities that we have: transit, pedestrian, bicycle. So let's set the standard, figure out what it is, and if it's, here's what it is in red, here's what it is in orange, etc., or we're going to combine red and orange, which I think makes sense to combine red and orange on this. Here's what it is, and fine, but come up with a number that everybody is comfortable with and make a recommendation to the committee. But I have no idea how to make a determination based on this type of trip in this case versus that type of. It just doesn't seem like a very, very reasonable way.
It's complicated. If I am understanding this correctly, really all we're talking about here is to what extent do we want localized mitigations to happen in these areas?
Right.
Because all of this, or almost all of this, is going to be creditable against the transportation impact tax.
Right.
So we're not talking about whether we're going to add to exactions overall. We're going to get the same amount of developers one way or the other. The question is, do we want to have them required to do more localized bike, ped, and transit, mitigation as part of their project, or do we just want to pay into the Transportation Trust Fund and have the county allocate that money overall? I think that's, I still think that's really the only question fundamentally that we're grappling with. And I think that DOT's perspective is sort of that, don't overdo it here. Like, yes, you want these mitigations locally, but it's probably not worth going through all that unless the project is at a certain size threshold. And I think planning is sort of saying, let's just do it all the time, always, because that's our policy. Is that a fair summary?
I'd like to hear from DOT and Mr. Conklin could share his perspective.
I don't know if he's still on.
He's there.
He is. He just showed up on screen.
I think that's a fair perspective. The major concerns we have is that the policies end up with isolated facilities that aren't providing the public benefit, require long-term maintenance, and detract from the county's ability to execute on priority projects where the impact tax funds could be used. So the tests are useful in some cases to determine, yes, we want the facility to be built with the project, but I think even Chairman Anderson earlier mentioned the proportionality and the connection to a broader network are important considerations with this. And I think Councilmember Friedson is right on track that to the extent we can de-Rubik's Cube the pathway into these tests so that they're understandable both by the development community and the public, and why some apply sometimes and not others, is really, really important. I do feel like this is a lot of hard work. A lot of it's technically sound in how this is developed, but it ends up being so extremely complicated to figure out what's actually required and whether the test results in an outcome or not, that those are the challenges that the committee really needs to wrestle with.
Okay, and then to the threshold question, planning staff had recommended, what was it again, Jason?
We had recommended 100 person peak hour person trips.
Regardless of mode. And then the planning board just said.
And we also had in a 5, the de minimis of 5 of that particular mode. But then the planning board said, let's not deal with the 5 de minimis for that particular mode, but instead let's make it, scope it so that we can have, it can be proportional. So they added a 50 peak hour person trip level and then a 100 peak hour person trip level. Because 50 is where we'd already been kicking in the motor vehicle test previously. So,
and is it because you run a test, does that mean you have to do what is, so you run the test, what does that mean you have to do as a result?
If you run the test and then you fail, that's when you have to do the mitigation, which, as you're describing, is basically saying it's going to be a local improvement as opposed to, because it's going to offset that impact tax contribution, which can be used more globally.
Keep in mind, these are issues we already deal with if the facilities are called for in one of the respective master plans. The test, it being in the master plan, presumes that the development should build it unless the requirement to build it is not proportionate to the development proposed. And the example that comes up all the time is you have a single-family house that has 1,000-foot frontage on the street, and the cost to build the facility is dramatically outsized to the project that's proposed. The planning department usually consults with us to come up with an alternative arrangement that's proportional. And I'm not sure we get much more out of these tests than that process is already, but I'm not as expert in that as Jason, so I look for his guidance on how this links to those processes that already exist.
Is there a way, as Councilmember Friesen described, to come back with something in this SSP that makes more sense, or is that take too long, or do we need, I didn't really hear an answer. I heard agreement with that Rubik's cubing. I like that term, but is that possible in this SSP to do that?
Well,
I think we can do. I think
what
we
he's
can
saying
do
is, you guys all talk and then tell us
Right.
what you actually agree upon.
Yeah, come back. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Can we punt? Can we punt on it right now?
Well,
I think we can.
Just paying for it with impact taxes and leaving it, to the normal process without all these tests.
Well, we could do that, council members. I think we could do that certainly for the bike test, and we could do it for the short-term pedestrian test. We haven't really gotten into the pedestrian test at all. I still recommend that we get rid of the transit test. The bike that was really a bus service test because of the reasons that I mentioned.
I don't think we weighed in the official comments on that. The purpose of it, you want to be comprehensive in the major modes that would serve a project as part of this policy. That's why it was introduced in 2016. I'm not going to sit here today and say it's been meaningful in the way it's been implemented, and there are issues with transit, the flexibility and things that are different than the other modes. So I don't know, again, Jason and the planning department, the planning board are the ones who have proposed this. I don't know what their strong feelings are about it, but from our perspective, we'd be happy to look at whether this is the right test or whether this type of test is needed or not.
Okay.
It hasn't shown that it is, but I feel on whole by not having a comprehensive set of standards for all the major modes.
Just remind you that for transit, we're already requiring, or will be requiring even more in the future TDM measures, which are primarily going to come down to transit.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be a lot more, and it's not just a one-time payment. We're talking about annual TDM payments. We're talking about annual operating expenses. That's going to probably be a bigger lift than it will be for building some one-time expenditures for bikeways or for sidewalks.
Right.
Or for cross, and so I think, well, I've told you what I think.
In the
about
interest of
transit.
not spinning our wheels continuously talking about something that I think we're mostly in agreement on here, could we have, I think I've asked for it, Councilmember Joanna's asked for it, I think planning staff, Department of Transportation staff, and council staff come together, figure out what is a comprehensive, cohesive standard for these tests, and if you want to include in that a potentially, more appropriate, more effective transit test, if there's a better way to do that, and you want to propose it to the committee. I would personally be interested in that. I'm not interested if we are doing tests to not have a transit test under the premise that buses aren't really transit or it's hard to figure out who rides buses. But I do understand the point that it's different and what we're currently doing isn't really working all that well, and we should be willing to adjust and adapt once we recognize that things aren't working the way that we want. It's not as effective as we would like to be. I think Councilmember Jawando has said that. I think I've said that. Mr. Chair, I don't know if you're in agreement with that, but I don't think we're very far apart here. I just think we need a tangible, specific proposal before us that reflects what we're all talking about here.
Well, we will do that.
Okay. And I have to leave, so I hope that you're not going to decide on any of this. Sounds like we're not, but I need to jump off, but I will loop back with my colleagues and with Dr. Orland if there's anything else. But I think, Mr. Chairman, you were anticipating pausing sometime soon, I think.
Yep. Okay.
So go down to the safety test.
what's our schedule for the next, when can we come back to this, Glenn, if we wanted to pause now?
It would be in a couple of weeks. I don't have the exact date in front of me, but next Wednesday you have a set of meetings like you had today on schools, so it wouldn't be then. But I believe it would be sometime the following week. So that would give us time to actually, the staffs, to try to pull something together in the next, 4 or 5 work days.
Okay, so if that's for the coming back on the transit, bike, and PHED tests.
Yeah. How much more time do you have today? We have some other issues. Some could be quick. And
I don't know. I mean, candidly, for Will, I really was thinking, my own self, I was thinking I would endure this until 4:30 today. So I understand you need to break. There's no free lunch here, so if we don't get through some of this stuff now, we're going to have to get through it later. It could be that this is a non-controversial item and you can just sign off on it, in absentia.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, your prerogative. I'm just saying I had allocated 3:30 and stayed till 4. I mean, but Dr. Orland can, if there are decisions made in my absence, I will chime in with him later.
Well, let's try to do the safety thing. Hopefully it'll be smoother. This is, the SSP stuff just takes a long time. There's no real way around it.
Okay. All right. The safety test, basically it's a new test, and what the planning board is recommending is that it be based on the results of a predictive safety analysis, which is a tool which is being worked on. It's apparently not going to be ready until actually next summer. And the short of it is that recommending not including this in the SSP now, but to come back next summer or next fall, once that work is done and the council has a chance to review it, to take this issue up.
Sorry, I was just taking a breath. What did you say there, Glenn?
I was too quick. Basically, the planning board is recommending a new test for safety system test based on the results of a tool that they're developing called the predictive safety analysis, which would forecast crashes at particular locations and to see whether or not it would add to accidents as a result of a development proposal, because of the additional number of trips that are being generated and the amount of traffic that's being generated. DOT's raised a lot of concerns about it, a lot of support for this kind of thing, of course, as well. My point is, I think this is really premature because the basic tool that would be used to predict this hasn't been developed yet. However, it will be finished, hopefully actually from planning staff, they believe it will be finished by the summer. And so I think we should come back to this as a potential SSP amendment either late next summer or fall.
Okay.
And not wait 4 years, but just do it when it's ready.
Comments from the planning board.
I don't know if anyone else is going to comment.
Falls to you, Jason.
Okay, I think it does. So I just, my initial reaction to that is, oh boy, this is going to be the SSP update that never ends. But the
welcome to our world.
Right. Well, yeah. To a certain extent, I mean, that was part of what we had put in the recommendation. The recommendation obviously would not, that this safety system test would not apply until that predictive safety analysis was completed. And what we had put, I think the language we had put in there said something about that upon planning board approval following completion of the predictive safety analysis. So, one option could be to just not include this, and then we'd have to bring it up, go through the whole normal amendment process, or we could include language in there now that says, here is when this would take effect, and it could be more than planning board approval. It could be that it needs to be presented to, the council, and the council that, I don't know, through resolution, something to simplify the effort to make this happen as opposed to going through a full amendment.
Yeah, the concern I have with that is, and the same is true with the higher grade pedestrian test that was proposed, is the council really needs to understand what it is and then act on it and make changes if you want to before it goes into effect, not just give a blank check to the planning board and say, well, if they like it, then it automatically goes into effect. Most of the public doesn't know what this means. I don't know what it means. The development community doesn't know what it means. And let's get it all out there and have a thorough review of it. And it'll also give a lot more focus to the public as well to the council on this issue so that you know what you're doing. Basic public policy. So, I think I think that's why I'm recommending it later. It's not.
I kind of have to agree with Glenn here. I mean, doesn't feel quite comfortable to say go ahead and just whatever you come up with will be fine. Andrew.
I was good going forward with the adequacy test, actually, with some type of requirement to come back to the council to explain it. I think the question is, is this something we're going to do or something we're not going to do? I mean, we have worked with the planning board and planning staff to come up with this predictive safety analysis. We made commitments to Vision Zero. At a certain point, we're either serious about it or we're not. What that mechanism is to come back to the council, I don't feel terribly strongly about. I do think we need to know what it is, but I don't think it's unreasonable to say that we support it and to be ready to move forward. I think you open back up through SSP amendment. I think that's a little bit more formal than figuring out what type of, what are the specifics of the test. And we do things like this all the time. You call them blank checks. I mean, through regular regulatory review, it's not uncommon for the council to set a broad policy expectation to another branch of government or another body, and then say you have to come back before you actually deploy it, but go do it. So I'm not going to fight you on this, but
well, let's hear about the process that you'll use. I think stakeholders would say, how do we know that we get to weigh in? Like, what if we don't want it, we don't like it, we want to see you do it differently? So, to planning, how would you, if we wanted to say, fine, you can come back and brief us on it? How would that? Everybody who's watching is going to be interested to know what this new process would be and how to have an influence on it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and so I don't know. I mean, legal staff might have a better sense of how it could be written, what language could be written into the current SSB update resolution that would require some sort of sign off from the council, and in short of you being comfortable with what that predictive safety analysis provides. You would have to actually be comfortable with it and somehow approve that. But I don't know what that legal language would be that would have to go into the...
It's Gwen. I think what you might do is have something that says this SSP/growth policy endorses the concept of a predictive safety analysis based test in LATR. However, it will need to come back to both the planning board and the council for approval of. It's almost like we do with executive regulations. We endorse a particular idea, and then we say you have to come back with the detailed executive regulations.
Would there be?
And it would be a public process. We would not do it without, working with the community.
Would there be
one thing?
hearing?
Well, one thing we could do, we used to do this in growth policies all the time. We sort of got away from it the last 10 years or so. There was always a to-do list in the resolution. In other words, the resolution you adopted before November 15th would say, here are things that we want the planning board, or sometimes it's DOT, the executive, to come back to. And you can even put date certains on it by a certain time. And you could say, just what Gwen was saying, you say the council endorses the idea of a safety system adequacy test, and we want the planning board to bring that back as, I would still say, as an SSP amendment. It makes a really formal action, and we guarantee to have a council public hearing. And you could even put some kind of, maybe not an ironclad date, but a sort of a strongly worded directive to say that it should get here by, July of 2021. Or
first of all, I think this is an interesting idea. I think it's kind of novel. I'm not aware of. Has anyone ever done this before?
The idea of a safety test?
Well, predictive safety test.
It is a new idea. There are other places that have done predictive safety analyses. We're sort of basing our work on some work that was done in Seattle. But I think taking it into our growth policy is a new idea. And
I think it'd be worth it to do it do the full process. We're so overwhelmed by the volume of content in the SSP. It's like it almost goes through without even having a chance to even think about what it really is. This would be a discrete piece that's kind of interesting, and might be. So I'm okay with the staff recommendation of having as just.
And we haven't talked about the pedestrian test really at all. But again, the planning, and we're not going to get into the details of this, but the planning board did recommend a much more detailed pedestrian test. And a lot of that depends on the result, the completion of the pedestrian level of comfort map, which is also not expected to be finished until sometime this coming summer. And so perhaps it's an S&P amendment on both.
So, well, the thing that's different on that, Glenn, is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we have an existing pedestrian test.
Oh, yeah, we still have the existing.
And this is just an enhancement or a broadening, perhaps. We don't have a safety test. That's a brand new thing. And so, I think that what I'm sort of hearing is generally that the committee feels like we should come back on the safety test and have it on the to-do list.
Clear, but...
Okay.
Well, here's what I'm hearing.
We're split.
No, I think you've tasked the staff to try to come back on the bicycle test and the pedestrian test in the next week or so. And the pedestrian test, though, are in two parts. There's the existing test, and then there's the much broader test that's being proposed. And the broad test includes things like looking at streetlights and such. We could come back with the hopefully a consensus on the bicycle test and on the changing the existing pedestrian test. So it isn't just exactly the existing the pedestrian test we have now. It could be more enhanced. But then postpone the sort of part 2 of the pedestrian test and the safety test till next summer as part of an SSP amendment.
So I would say, I mean, it seems logical to consider both of those at the same time. The one other difference between the pedestrian level of comfort and the predictive safety analysis is that the PLOC, the pedestrian level of comfort map, it is, we built out a large part of this already. So there's no question of what is this going to look like, what does it mean, what does it show, where, you have those questions with the predictive safety analysis because we don't have anything to show you yet on that. But we've done a large part of the county already with the PLOC map as part of our pedestrian master plan effort. So.
I think the only distinction between the two approaches is whether we're going to have a public hearing or not. And I think just have a public hearing.
Well, I'm all for public hearings, so I'm fine with that. I think we need to set a very clear statement of policy in the document that we support moving in this direction, because I would hate for us to take it out and create any idea that we are moving backwards away from our Vision Zero goals as opposed to moving towards it with full speed. And I appreciate, I think of this predictive analysis because I've gotten some briefings from Mr. Sartori on. I'm really excited about it. I think it's a really significant, positive, tangible move towards our Vision Zero goals, which have been far too slow. We all recognize. And, I think we're on somebody has said before, we're on the cutting edge, but not the bleeding edge. We don't have to be the first to do it, but the cutting edge, among the first. We learn from what others do, and I think this is a good example of actually fulfilling what we say we're going to do, and I just want to make sure that we reflect that in the document.
Okay. So I think I got the direction.
Well,
right.
The thing was we were going to revisit the transit test also before the next work session.
Right. Right.
Yes,
That's right.
Glenn. Yes, Dr. Orland. We were going to revisit the transit.
I know. We will do that. The next issue is Vision Zero resources. Vision Zero impact statement. The planning board is recommending that every development generating 50 trips, peak hour person trips, generate an impact statement, which includes 6 elements, and they're listed in the packet. The executive and DOT raised concerns about this. They believe that a lot of this information already exists. And the crash analysis that's being recommended as one of the items is something that development consultants typically don't have the expertise to do. My recommendation is I agree. I think this is just another essentially a bureaucratic step that we don't really need to have. I mean, between the expertise of the planning staff and the DOT staff in all these areas, and the complete streets design guide, which is going to be finished for the next couple of months, there's going to be plenty of guidance as to what to do with regards to Vision Zero. We don't need a Vision Zero impact statement. The parallel was made with the bicycle and pedestrian impact statement that was required by the council several years ago at the behest of Councilmember Andrews. I have to say, if that was important at the time, because when bicycle and pedestrian facilities were not really looked at too carefully, we've gone way, way beyond that. So we still have that requirement in the law, but it's kind of useless. Nobody pays attention to that anymore. If it's done, I think no one's seen one for several years. So I'm worried about creating another a statement which looks good in terms of we're hitting Vision Zero again, but it really doesn't provide any more useful information that already exists or already has amongst the people involved with reviewing developments. So I recommend not including this provision in the SSP.
Let's hear from the planning board.
I'm going to ask Mr. Gray to step in here. I think we're slowly losing people, and I think
Why? Because it's Friday at 4:50.
It could be.
Yes, this is Eric with the planning department. I think it's still staff's position that the statement is still important and useful. I think that and I'll be quite frank with you. One thing that we think that this could provide, information that this could provide, is additional information that we can use to support some of these tools that we have, Vision Zero related tools that we have under development in terms of providing data that can support them. So there is a self-serving motivation, I think, for requesting this information that can be gathered from this Vision Zero impact statement. So we think it's useful in terms of supporting our Vision Zero goals and objectives.
What does DOT think about this?
Gary, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. I think the issue really is we don't really think developers should be doing things to develop a database for use later. I mean, that's really not very functional.
Explain what you mean, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry?
Can you explain what you mean there?
Yeah, I mean, because this is a data gathering effort, I think, that Eric was talking about. This is to go and look at the accidents, the statistics, to drum up, get data on facilities that are adjacent nearby the project, and we have a lot of that already, and we should be better at gathering the database than should individual consultants that go in and then have to ask the state or ask us for the data that we currently have. So I think that we don't really need an outside party to help put together a database. And so I would think that should not be a requirement.
And how does this differ from the Vision Zero resources that is the next item?
That's different because what's being asked there by the planning board is that as a developer comes in and does his traffic study, that if they see that there is something incorrect in the database for bikeways or sidewalks or for really any of these bullets that are mentioned there, that they should report that to the planning board so they can update their databases. So, for example, there may not be an up-to-date, to-the-minute kind of database showing where every sidewalk is, or where every element of the bicycle and pedestrian network, and this would do that. Since they're in the vicinity area, they're already looking at it. This just basically requires them to report any changes that don't seem to be in our database now, to have them update rather than having staff go out there constantly and trying to go through the whole county. I think that actually makes a lot of sense. I would just expand it actually to include any database having to do not just with bikes and PEDs, but also the road network and the transit network. I mean, if there's a change to where the bus stop is, and that's not in the database, that should be reported. So I'm supportive of that one, just in fact broadening it a little bit. And that's really not much of a requirement on the developer since they're out there anyway.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, it seems like the real purpose of this impact statement is to require the developer to consider Vision Zero strategies in their site plan and in their in their proposal. They're going to have to produce a report, and then essentially you're going to have that report at the time that they're applying, and you would compare what they've proposed to do versus what that report might have showed. I mean, you're not doing the report, you're requiring them to do a report. So I suppose you're not controlling what's in the report. It's something that the developer is required to do, not the county. Andrew?
Yeah, I agree with the need to do this. I'm confused as to who we're requiring to do it. And I'm sympathetic to the Department of Transportation's views that the property owners and applicants may not be equipped to do this work. They may not have access to the data that's required to do it. I'm just confused. Why doesn't county government or planning do the impact analysis? I mean, if we're serious about Vision Zero, we should be analyzing every property development through the regular review process under the prism of Vision Zero. Is that, how safe or unsafe is this for users, and how easy it is to access the property, ingress and egress. I mean, Vision Zero should be viewed as a key safety component, like fire exits are.
That's exactly what they do.
Why aren't we doing the analysis? I mean, I think we should be doing this, but I'm not sure we should be requiring it on folks who might not be equipped to do it. We should be requiring it of ourselves.
We are doing it.
We have staff at the development review that look at Vision Zero issues in safety, site distance requirements, and accident statistics. So we're currently doing that as part of our review of development proposals.
So can we hear from planning? What is the difference of what is currently happening versus what you're proposing to happen here? And is it possible for the enhancements that you're proposing to be handled either by county government or by planning? Because I am sympathetic to your point. I'm also sympathetic to planning's point that what we're doing isn't working. When it comes to Vision Zero, I mean, we are failing every day when it comes to providing safe roads for all users, and that's true not just in urban areas or in suburban areas or in rural areas. That's true countywide. We have not done as much as we need to do. So, I think there's, certainly sympathy from me for, what planning is trying to do here. But could you explain what you're looking to enhance and, whether or not you think those enhancements can be taken up by the county or by planning?
Well, I certainly think that the county and we as planning can certainly provide some of the information that's described in the Vision Zero impact statement. But the thinking is that if a developer has a traffic consultant that's going out there and doing a traffic impact study, that in the context of executing that study, that the data that would be provided in the Vision Zero impact statement could be collected and developed in the context of the consultant performing that study. So it would be an effort that would be done in collaboration with the traditional way that the developer consultant does traffic impact studies. It would be another layer of information that would be developed, but it would be done in concert while doing the study. So that's the thinking there.
No, we just took the red area out of contention of doing traffic studies. So the red area.
Red area would not do motor vehicle impact studies, but it would do the other studies would be would be done.
But they wouldn't be, well, whatever.
Mr. Conklin?
I would suggest that we put this in our work list for the next work session. I feel that there's a lot of overlap between this and the predictive safety analysis that we've talked about, and it would be better to combine this into one cohesive test. And a number of these items, this is a set of shared items. Some of these come from us, some of them come from the developer in their site plan process or concept plan process, like the driveway locations and speed studies and site distance. So a lot of this happens, but not in the framework of SSP already. And I think we would benefit from spending some time working through what makes sense as an adequacy test and what we can point to that's required by other processes and what the agency should be doing as part of the review of these statements, and make it a little bit less confusing.
I think that would be helpful. My view, I mean, Vision Zero should not just be, a test that we do. It should be part of every test that we do. It should be a standard of every single one of the other tests. And so, having something specific that strengthens the way that we look at this, I am very interested in that. But figuring out how it's done, I think, would be helpful. And to me, it seems that the county and planning should really be the leaders on this, but we should require it in some way and reference it in some way in the SSP to demonstrate the fact that we are serious about these issues.
Yeah, our work on these issues is at a network level, and this is site specific, so this stuff is already there. It's just not being looked at in the context of an individual site right now. So I think
what this does is it makes the developer pull all that stuff together, and then when you go to the DRC or you're at the site plan or whatever, you have some batch of information to look at, and maybe you strengthen the Vision Zero, policy decisions that you make in the process.
I think there is the possibility of that. It's just right now it's sort of a mismatch of stuff that comes from us or stuff that comes from the applicant.
All right, so I favor putting this on the work list for the next meeting, and if you guys can talk a little bit more and see if we can't put something together here that is, thought through with all the other elements. As you said, we've got the different tests that we're working on, and as I started the meeting, I mean, I'm trying to get my head around how the TDM policy interacts with all of this. I think I understand,
Lubricates achievement of these tests.
I think one of your colleagues raised concerns about the overlap of the various different tests and the various different costs, and perhaps suggested that we find a way to streamline them related to UMPs and TDMs and impact taxes and the SSP et al. So I would...
And let the record show that we have what we've done so far as a committee recommendation certainly does streamline a significant amount.
I agree. I just pointing out that I'm certainly in agreement there. It have been for quite some time. Yeah. So okay. I think we have two other items left on here that aren't particularly controversial.
We have four, actually, but I was going to suggest number 8, the mitigation priorities, is going to be very sticky, a lot of discussion, and then we postpone that to when we come back on the bike and pedestrian and transit tests as well, if that's okay with you guys. And then go just to the recommendations not included in the draft SSP resolution. I think these are pretty quick. One recommendation is that the planning board is recommending designating a Vision Zero representative to the DRC. DOT's already said they do have representation on DRC and they look at these issues. However, if you want to beef up the language that's in the subdivision ordinance, because the subdivision ordinance is where it actually has the language saying who's in the DRC and what they're supposed to cover. And that's that last page of your packet has an excerpt from the subdivision ordinance which explains that. And you're probably going to be doing this anyway because on the school side, one of the recommendations from the planning board is that MCPS, although they're already a member of DRC, will look at more than what they've been charged to do in the subdivision ordinance. So bottom line is my recommendation here is not include this language in the SSP because it really actually belongs in the subdivision ordinance, and introduce very soon maybe right after the SSP is done, a subdivision ordinance amendment that would accomplish these things.
It would accomplish them not by adding a representative, but through other means?
There are already representatives from DOT and MCPS, but the roles that they fill, one could argue that the DOT's roles, that if you look at that last page, it lists all the things it's supposed to look at.
DOT should be, yes. I mean, look, first of all, I agree that DOT should be there as well as planning to fight for Vision Zero. And if they're not, like, we got a whole other problem. And I'm worried about adding one more person who may not respond in a timely manner, on a request.
Just more.
The answer for us is not another body. It's to make sure that the people who are there are representing the right interests and the right issues.
Now that sort of gets back to the previous discussion about these impact statements. While I'm a little nervous about it, the idea of forcing Vision Zero explicitly into this conversation, I think, is a good one. So who does that and how we do that, but to your point, Chris, like I would like to know exactly how is it that we can ensure that Vision Zero is more deliberatively addressed, through the process. So
are we agreeing on the recommendation?
Well, I'm agreeing with myself. I think that I don't want to add another body. At least, yeah.
I support designating a Vision Zero route. So just we can let that go on.
So
I guess my point is
that as the Vision Zero route. You mean?
You're saying the DOT would be the Vision Zero or a new Vision Zero rep, period.
I support planning board recommendation.
Okay, you support the planning board recommendation.
Well, the planning board's recommendation is put in the SSP. The SSP isn't where the DRC is actually. That's not where it's defined. What should be on the DRC? It's actually in the subdivision ordinance, Circle 27. You'll see Section 50-4.2, subsection A2, lists DOT and all the things they need to address. If you wanted to add Vision Zero, someone from either Wade Holland or someone who works directly for him on here, then you would add an item number 12, which would be in the Vision Zero office. But that's where it would be.
My point was that this is a scope and training issue for the staff we already have there. This is not solved by a different body.
I mean, listen, I don't feel strongly of where it is, but I do agree that it should happen. So, I'm happy to, move separately that we do what you've suggested, Glenn, to put it in the place that you think would be more appropriate. I don't disagree that, the SSP might not be the most appropriate place for it, but if the question is, do I support what the planning board is recommending here with a Vision Zero focused representative, the answer is yes. And, where that leaves me with colleagues, I'm not sure.
Take a different view. I want to know that DOT is advocating for Vision Zero. I think it would be a problem if DOT has one view and the Vision Zero coordinator has a different view. That's a problem.
Yes.
So I want to figure that out.
The right answer from my point of view is to expand the charge of our people participating in this process to make sure these issues are adequately addressed.
So how
literally, you could solve this by when you amend Section 50-4.2 under item A2, add the words Vision Zero to all the list.
Right.
It says DOT is there for roads, streets, intersection locations, site access, site distances, traffic calming, paths, pedestrian bicycle facilities, including bike share, parking, transit facilities, transit demand management elements, and storm drainage within county-maintained rights-of-way and easements. And you can include in there Vision Zero.
Right.
Well, does that translate into a specific review of a project for its Vision Zero attributes? And that should be, I think the point is Vision Zero needs to be a topic of the DRC, of the development process. And frankly, everybody at the table needs to be thinking about how to achieve that goal. And I think DOT is the agency that we primarily charge with Vision Zero. And so they should be the assertive voice, but also planning. Planning is very assertive on Vision Zero. So when we come back, I don't know that what you just said, Glenn, is enough to make me comfortable that it's real. So
all I'm saying is that however you want to craft the subdivision ordinance amendment, that you could work on that. But it wouldn't be in the SSP because that's not where it belongs.
Yeah, and I would just say, to the point, I agree with the overall mentality of like everybody in county government should be focused on Vision Zero, and certainly everybody in the Department of Transportation. But one look at the Twitter feed would suggest otherwise. And the reality is, if everybody in county government was so focused on pedestrian and bike safety, we wouldn't need to have Vision Zero. We wouldn't need to have specific policies that really focus on that. We specifically do this to target the focus in a way that actually achieves what we want. And I just think we need to be really focused on this. We're either serious about it or we're not. I'm open to, looking at what the appropriate mechanism in order to do this. But the idea that we're not going to do it, I don't think is something that I would be supportive of. If the committee or ultimately the council ultimately goes another direction, I respect that, but I just want to be very clear.
So
Adding a word on a document is not accomplishing what this was intending to accomplish.
right. So what I was asking for is I'd like to see as an alternative language that explains how Vision Zero will be addressed in a very thorough, explicit manner. And it's analogous to the Vision Zero impact statement, I think, which in some ways I really like. The point being, as a project is going through, you've got to consider all these elements. I think the point that maybe it's more appropriate for that responsibility to be on the county than on the developer makes some sense, because I'm not sure I want to rely on the developer's view of what is safe. I'd rather have the county, having to make that call. But having Vision Zero be an explicit public or explicit deliberate topic with even a report, I think that makes sense. So that I would like to see expressed, see how that could be done. And if it's unsatisfying, then we'll have to rely perhaps on adding a person there. If you can't come back to us with a way that the whole process is going to address it, then the fallback is then we're going to have to send a person there to battle it out. But I don't think we have to, so we'll follow up there.
Could I ask a related question? The Vision Zero resource, we mentioned it to differentiate it from the other item, the impact statement before it, but I don't believe we ever gave direction on that. I don't think there's any controversy there. I support that. I think it sounded like the chair supports it and staff supports it, but I don't know if we actually got through that.
I supported it with a recommendation that it be broadened to include not just updating the bike and pedestrian information, but also the roadway and transit.
So that's different from the impacts report. This is
Yes.
the developer's traffic consultant must produce a report that essentially addresses Vision Zero issues. That's different than an impact statement. So one is a report on Vision Zero, and one is an impact statement.
Well, there were really three different things. The Vision Zero resources isn't even a report. It just says that if the traffic consultant is out there trying to put together his analysis, if he sees something or she sees something which is different than what's in the database for Park and Planning has or DOT on the bicycle system, the pedestrian system, and I would say also the transit system and the roadway system, that they should report it. They must report it, and then that would allow the governments to update their databases.
This is a very minor thing. This is updating if there's an inaccuracy in the existing network data. I don't think there's any disagreement that if you find that there's a problem with the county's data, that you should let us know so we can fix it. I mean, this is like a pretty...
That's close to a nothing burger.
Yeah,
Right.
If you're
That's
thirsty, you should drink water. I mean, this is not controversial.
Correct.
Well, yeah. Okay. So
you
that
concur with
is
We
that?
agree on that.
satisfactory,
I don't think Councilmember Giwando is going to object to that.
Last two items. Well, did you make a decision about so on the DRC is the idea is that you look at a subdivision ordinance amendment to incorporate the ideas you're talking about. Again, you're probably going to need to do it for schools anyway.
I think you should come to us with a proposal that reflects the intention of the planning board with what you believe is the most effective and appropriate mechanism to come forward, and the committee will vote on that. That would be my suggestion, Mr. Chair.
May I just speak? I had understood that the committee was asking DOT and Park and Planning to develop a statement as to how the Vision Zero will be evaluated in the DRC and give it more depth than just adding the name to the subdivision staging policy.
that's, I think, what Andrew just said. That we're seeking you to come back with a written explanation of how the process will address these issues without adding a body, and we'll evaluate that in comparison to the planning board's proposal. I thought Andrew said it well as far as achieving the intent that the planning board had.
Right. Right. Well, we share that concern. The county executive is equally committed to Vision Zero and pedestrian safety. So we will come back, hopefully, with a statement that is acceptable. And if we have to do a second person, then so be it.
Okay. Two more items, and one's really quick, and one's basically punting. The last page. One of the recommendations of the planning board is just continue producing the travel monitoring report. The planning board's been doing this under different names for several years, since 2004, and it's a useful report. No one disagrees with continuing to do it, so I'm concurring with the planning board.
Okay.
And then finally, a huge issue really is policy review of master plans and how that's done. I'm recommending punting on this for now because it's not really part of the SSP. It's not something that you have to adopt by November 15th. This is basically how you determine land use transportation balance in master plans. It's an important topic because that frames what you do in master plans, and it should be done before the next major master plan comes. But I don't think it needs to be sort of jammed into this next few weeks because this could take an entire meeting on its own. I recommend.
Planning board is bringing back PAMR?
Well, for master plan analysis, not for subdivision staging. So it's not PAMR, but some kind of policy.
Now this is ringing a bell. Jason, tell me more.
Yeah. Right. So this is how we evaluate our master plans so that when we bring a master plan to you, we're not saying, here's what this intersection is going to look like or how much congestion. We're not taking LATR and applying that to the master plan for 20, 30 years in the future. Instead, we're taking a look 20, 30 years in the future at how balanced will transportation and the land use that's proposed in this master plan be from a more area-wide perspective. And my only concern with punting this is I wouldn't want to punt it because Dr. Orland's correct. This is not really part of the SSP because it's just we've always used the tools that are available to us in the SSP. And when 4 years ago we eliminated PAMR, the TPAR or PAMR even before that, right? That we were left without a policy area analysis to apply to our master plans. And so, and my concern about punting it is if we punt it too far, we have a number of master plans that we're preparing right now, and we would really want to know what types of analysis we should be doing on those. And we can't wait until we bring it to you. We need to, we're gathering data, we're doing stuff now, and we need to know what type of data we need to be gathering, whether it's the LATR type of analysis that we've been doing, or if it's more reflective of the things that we've recommended here.
Okay. My specific recommendation is that the FED committee set this issue aside for now, but plan on returning to it either later this fall or winter. So yes, do it soon.
And we wouldn't need to reintroduce it because it's already been introduced.
It's not part of the SSP. I mean, it wouldn't be part of the SSP. You're making a separate decision as to what. There's nothing in the SSP resolution which refers to this because it's not subdivision staging. It's about master plans. It's a recommendation they included in their report, just like the travel monitoring report. That's not a recommendation. That's a recommendation in the report, but there's no reference to it in the SSP resolution. That's why this whole category is called issues that are outside of the SSP resolution. So there's no reason why you have to act on this by November 15th.
So, Mr. Sartori, what's the compelling reason why we wouldn't take Dr. Flynn's recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think we'd be fine with that as long as we do get it done soon, right? Because we want to have guidance for, in particular, our downtown Silver Spring plan and Fairland and others that we're working on now so that we can make sure that we're pursuing the correct.
Okay.
All right. So can we put in? Sorry.
And this is Eric. I would argue that I agree that it's not explicitly part of the SSP, but just like we look at impact taxes in concert with the SSP, I think that this particular issue also should be looked at in concert with the SSP because it's implicitly it's part of the SSP, even though explicitly it's not.
And give me a scope of what is involved here. Like if we wanted to take this up thoroughly at FED, are we talking about, more than one session? Is this a, several session deliberation or what do you think?
This is just a guess, but I would say it's probably one full work session.
Well,
maybe more.
But you need to have something to present. And right now, the planning department has done a lot of thinking about this but for Thrive, and then want to use the Thrive 2050 metrics and see how that applies to master plans. The scales are not the same. The analysis is different, and that's work that hasn't been done. So I don't think we're in a position. I as a staff person, I don't think we're in a position to come up with a methodology and metrics to look at master plans.
What the immediate concern is you need something for Silver Spring, which is underway. So it's not a regulation; it's an analysis. So we could return to this very soon. November, maybe even October, and we can be iterative here.
Not October.
Not October. November.
Not October.
November.
June. December, January.
Soon enough.
Not October.
I get one vote, but I don't get to determine the agenda, so I yield to the chair on this.
We can return to this soon enough for the planning board to meet its needs as far as the the Silver Spring plan, if that's the immediate concern, and we could try to resolve it then. I'm okay with that. I truly have no idea what this proposal is. I didn't get briefed on it yet, so it's hard for me. I'm flying blind a little bit here, but I'm always anyway. So it's
all right. That sounds good. So the other item, the mitigation priorities item it's controversial, so we're not going to take it up at 4:50 on Friday afternoon. But I just wanted to touch base for planning purposes to get a sense of when do we expect to take that up, and when do we expect to come back with the Vision Zero, the various tests, and the other staff follow-up items, Mr. Chair.
I'm looking at I'm trying to find the calendar that we sent out to you guys of the meetings. Take me a bit, sorry. But it wouldn't be next week. Probably the earliest would be the following week, the week after next. But it would be on, Mr. Friedson, it would be on the mitigation priorities as well as the transit, bike, and pedestrian tests. And you also wanted to hopefully get back to you also on the language for the subdivision ordinance change regarding Vision Zero, and also the some more discussion about the Vision Zero impact statement. All of those things. We may need to have another meeting, but it certainly won't happen next week. It probably would be the following week.
okay.
Certainly within the committee review period before this all goes to council office.
We have we have to get this done.
Yeah.
So, all right. So we did not get a chance to go over this one. This one. You want to remove payment in lieu of mitigation as an option.
Again, if you really want to get into it now, because this is really complicated, and and it would be.
I'd be on our list. It sounds like we're going to have at least a 2-hour meeting next time as well.
And are we adding a meeting, or are we including that in the existing meeting?
Let us figure it out. We have to look at the schedule. We have to talk to Selena. We'll have to just see what's available.
All right. I will.
I know. I can say for sure.
Await guidance here, Mr. Cashner, on this train.
Just remember what you did today on transportation. This is like maybe a third of what you'll be doing in schools. Okay.
I'm not complaining. I would stay here for longer. My work goes well beyond 5 p.m. So, whatever behooves the chair. I'm here. Just let me know where to be, and I'm happy to
big talker
join. Pardon?
Okay.
I said you're a big talker. All right. Well, I'm done. I mean, it's 4:50.
We're done. Yeah.
Okay.
I would have stayed for longer, but if everybody wants to go, I'm happy to go.
Out of respect for Meredith, I think she wants to go home.
No, I am home.
No.
No, I'm fine. We can just keep going, but I appreciate the consideration. So
Just want another cup of coffee.
I'll take the one for the team. I'm ready to shut down.
Yeah, I gave out lunch. I didn't eat lunch, so I actually do look forward to doing that.
It appears that I'm the only one in an office here, so I'm the one that wants to go home. So thank you.
You're also the only one in a suit, Mr. Sartori, but we appreciate your formality. It's very nice of you.
Yes.
All right.
Everybody be
That was
safe.
fun.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Good
everybody.
weekend.
Let's do it
Bye.
again next
Sure.
week.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Remain closed at all times as construction access as well as state